Gwen shuffled down the street, barely moving her feet. She was coming back from the shop. She had recently received money, so the elderly woman went to the nearest supermarket. She had to buy potatoes, some meat, some cereals were almost out, and also milk, flour, and sugar. The bag was heavy, although before for Gwen it was not a weight. In the cow she used to pull hay with a pitchfork, carry huge boxes, and carry buckets full of milk or water. It was a lot of work, but now Gwen was in her 70s, and age was certainly taking its toll. Her back often ached, her arms were weak, and she dragged the bag from the supermarket with great difficulty, slowly stopping every now and then to catch her breath. A couple of times she was helped by passers-by and two teenage boys with school bags on their shoulders, and a middle-aged woman and a tall young guy offered to help her. But Gwen refused with a smile. She was in no hurry to go anywhere. And these people are kind. It was immediately obvious, were in a hurry to do their own thing. So why distract them? Gwen walked so slowly not only because she was held back by a heavy bag, she just did not want to go home. And home, the place where she was now returning, language could not be called. So shelter was home. She used to have a house, spacious, bright, cozy, with a big kitchen and a stove for half a room, with a vegetable garden and a carved arbor, which Gwen's father used to put up. With beloved friends and neighbors nearby, Gwen lived well, although her work was hard. She worked most of her life on the farm in the cow shed and looked after the animals and cleaned the pens. She worked double shifts to provide her son with everything he needed. She would leave in the dark and return when the sun was already setting over the horizon. Her back ached, her arms and legs ached, but still the old woman recalled those times with nostalgia. She felt much happier then than she did now. The cold November rain came suddenly without warning, in the form of a drizzle, as if someone upstairs had opened a tap of ice water. Gwen hurried up. The walk seemed to be canceled. We'd have to go back. There was no way out. The rain was picking up and the wind was picking up. No, there was no way to get home. She had to wait it out. Gwen hurried to the porch of the nearest shop, where she could stand under the canopy until the rain stopped, and then she could go home. On the pattern-tiled platform, people gathered, cheerful children, for whom the sudden autumn downpour was another adventure, frowning adults, late because of the rain, on their business. Gwen's gaze suddenly fell on a young boy. He was standing with his back against the wall, staring indifferently at the street. Bright turquoise eyes, well-defined cheekbones, fringes falling down to his forehead, the color of ripe wheat, a real beauty. He must have a lot of girls. He looked just like Sebastian, a guy Gwen had known for only 2 days of her life. It had been almost 4 decades ago, and yet the older woman remembered every feature of the man's face, his scent, and the words he'd said to her. Sebastian, that man, if still alive, had long forgotten his casual acquaintance. How many had he had? Young girls are attracted to good looks. Sebastian does not realize that he has played such a role in the life of one of his many admirers. A key role, you could say. The guy Gwen was secretly watching pulled his phone out of his pocket and stared at the screen, occasionally running his finger across the display. He was either watching a video or reading something. Young people nowadays are so dependent on these gadgets. Good or bad, Gwen didn't know. Her youth was quite different. Gwen was born into a family of a tractor driver and a milkmaid. When she was only 2 years old, she became the eldest child. Her parents had another daughter who was named Kimberly. The family lived poorly, but decently. They did not starve, did not go in rags, but also did not go to resorts. Fur coats and luxury cars did not buy. Their parents worked hard, so Gwen and Kimberly learned early to take care of the house. Gwen, looking at modern children, who, in her opinion, overprotective parents, marveled. She and her sister, at the age of 7 or 8 years old, could already wash the floors, and lunch, and cook dinner. Not only that, the girls cleaned the yard, looked after the livestock, did their homework and laundry themselves, without reminder. And after all, they did not yet have the newfangled wonders of technology, which greatly simplify life: washing machines, dishwashers, multi-cookers, and so on. The girls still had a lot of free time. Having coped with the lessons and finished with household chores, the sisters with a clear conscience went to the street to friends. All their peers lived in the same way and had time to do housework, and at school, and with classmates to play. Gwen and Kimberly have always been very friendly, stood for each other mountain. Gwen has the fondest memories of her childhood. Then everything was simple, clear, and easy. The future was seen in bright colors. Gwen at school did not learn very well, unlike her younger sister. Kimberly, that all-on-the-fly grasped, and complex formulas for her were not a problem, and complicated rules of the Russian language in the head of her younger sister, all as if by itself on the shelves laid out. For Gwen, however, the sciences throughout her studies remained Chinese literacy. She seemed to try, she always did her homework. She was not lazy, did not slack off, well, not given probably. Kimberly, she understood everything effortlessly. She just had such a clear head. Her parents were proud of their youngest daughter. Maybe someone in the family will get a college education, dreamed her mother. You will get out in the people. My daughter, you have a head on your shoulders, reasoned the father. It is foolish to miss such a chance. You just try, and we will help. Gwen was also proud of her sister, but it hurt her to hear such words of her parents. Her mother and father didn't count on her. They didn't expect anything from her. All hope was in Kimberly. Kimberly did her best, studied and never called out her sister. On the contrary, she helped her with her lessons when Gwen was faced with another unsolvable task. Time passed. The sisters grew up. Gwen went to study in the city, went to college, specialty, chose a working technology of sewing products. The girl's hands always grew from the right place. She realized that she would become a good tailor. Right, approved the choice of the eldest daughter's father. The specialty is wonderful. You won't be left without a piece of bread. You have golden hands. Agreed with her mother, on your way. After studying, Gwen decided to stay in the city. The girl got a job in an attire, rented a flat nearby, began to take part-time work, and after a while Gwen already provided for herself. In the attire paid not so much, but very helpful part-time work. Someone to make a dress, someone to sew a coat, someone to sew a tablecloth or curtains to process. Gwen was never out of work, never out of money. Kimberly, meanwhile, studied at the university for a law degree. Ah, how the eyes of parents glowed with pride when they told acquaintances about it. For the eldest daughter, mother and father were calm. Hard-working, handy Gwen will not be lost. But the youngest daughter they were really proud of. You bet, smart, beautiful, and still at university. Gwen was genuinely happy for her sister. What can you do? Well, she was not given to chew the granite of science, but her hands with that end inserted, it is noted by everyone. Time passed. Gwen's friends got married, had children, and the girl herself with it somehow did not add up. Those who liked her did not attract her herself, and guys who liked Gwen, for some reason, preferred other girls. Such a paradox. Learning that the next friend or former classmate was going to marry, Gwen worried, and what if she will remain alone and lonely as an old maid? And even parents added oil to the fire. Every time the eldest daughter came to visit them, they pestered her with questions: when to marry, when children, when will you settle down? Kimberly's mother and father didn't pester her like that. For one thing, she was the youngest daughter. As long as her older sister didn't get married, she didn't have to worry about such things. Secondly, Kimberly was still in school, and after her 5th year she was going to go to graduate school. Parents were in awe of this choice of the younger daughter, saw her in dreams, a university teacher or even a professor, but from the eldest expected just human happiness, handy, cheerful, good-natured son-in-law, favorite grandchildren. Gwen was almost in despair. Every guy in her environment she looked at as a potential spouse and evaluated young people only from this position. Of course, such an obsession did not go unnoticed and scared off men. And then there was dancing in the club. Gwen went there with her friends. She was not particularly fond of dancing, and from the loud music she immediately began to have a headache, but at the dance can meet someone. Emily's friend is there. She found a husband there. They live together now. They are expecting their first child. Gwen wanted the same love, a husband, a child, simple human happiness. The girl carefully gathered for the event, put on her best dress, tight, short, revealing good legs, twisted her hair into curls, painted her eyelashes and lips, looked at herself in the mirror, and, satisfied with the result, slipped out of the house. Gwen didn't hold out much hope, as she went to the dance at least once every 2 to 3 months and always came back with nothing. But that night, that evening turned out to be completely different, unusual, magical, amazing. Sebastian first turned his attention to one of Gwen's friends, the blue-eyed beauty Beatrice. The boy approached the flock of girls to get acquainted. He seemed to address all of them, but he kept his eyes on Beatrice. Gwen realized she was lost. When she saw the stranger's turquoise eyes, they looked cheerful, mischievous, with a slightly sly squint, and his smile like that would drive anyone crazy. Sebastian was a witty and fun conversationalist. He felt confident, not embarrassed like so many of the other guys. The girls in Gwen's company, and she herself, of course, looked at him as if mesmerized. Now Gwen envied Beatrice. She wished she could have this young man looking so interested in her rather than her friend. She would have given a lot for that, but Sebastian asked Beatrice to one dance, then another. Gwen watched them enviously from around the corner. She saw the boy try several times to hold Beatrice tighter than the rules of decency allowed. His hand slipped below her waist every now and then. Beatrice, embarrassed, tried to pull away. Gwen didn't understand her. What is this modesty and childish behavior? They're adults. They've already graduated. They're working. After another dance, the embarrassed Beatrice slipped outside, as if to get some fresh air. Gwen realized that her friend had just been frightened by her beau's pressure, so she had found an excuse to run away. Gwen had been watching the couple all evening and could see exactly what was going on. Sebastian hurried after his lady, but then Gwen got in his way, just as the slow music started to play. "Shall we dance?" Gwen smiled at the boy. It was a desperate and bold move. Actually, Gwen had never behaved like this before, but now it was as if someone was leading her by the hand. The girl suddenly felt relaxed, confident. She didn't have a shadow of doubt. Sebastian would definitely agree to dance with her. And so he did. For a moment, the boy stared at Gwen, as if trying to remember who she was. Well, of course, at the moment of acquaintance, Sebastian looked only Beatrice. He was not to others. But in the next second, the guy smiled radiantly at Gwen, which made her heart pound desperately, and her palms immediately sweat, and held out his hand to her. They danced in his arms, Gwen melting in his warm embrace. When the music stopped, he even kissed the girl. Of course, it was not the first kiss in Gwen's life, but she had never had such a reaction before. She felt dizzy and her eyes went dark. She wished Sebastian could hold her like this in his arms for the rest of her life. She didn't care if he kissed and hugged her in front of everyone. Let them look, let them be jealous. And she didn't care what or who would think of her. "Shall we go for a walk?" Sebastian suggested in a slightly hoarse voice. Svetlana was all for it. She wanted to be alone with him too. They wandered through the city at night, holding hands tightly. Sebastian said something about himself. Then Gwen asked questions about her life. When he learned that she lived alone, he suggested without preamble that they go to her place. Gwen agreed without hesitation. In the evening and at night, Gwen played a very pleasant role for herself. The girl imagined that she and Sebastian were husband and wife, who loved each other and were going to live together all their lives. She was pleased to be near this man, to take care of him. What happiness is it to fall asleep next to the one you love? Sebastian was already asleep, but Gwen lay looking at the ceiling and savored the sensation. The warmth of a loved one, his measured breathing, silence, calmness, just the two of them. Magical. Svetlana realized that she had fallen in love. She fell in love as she had never fallen in love in her life. She didn't know she was capable of such feelings. Gwen didn't know much about Sebastian. He had managed to say that he lived in another city. Which one he didn't mention. Nothing. Tomorrow will tell. Here the guy came to visit a friend. They served in the army together. He invited Sebastian as a friend of the groom, because Sebastian would be leaving soon, but now everything had changed. They met each other. Sebastian wasn't going anywhere, and if he did, he'd probably take her with him. He'd been looking at her all evening. Those looks, that spark between them, it was rare. How lucky they were to have met each other at the dance. In the morning, Gwen woke up to the sound of someone rattling pans in the kitchen. Her nose caught the scent of scrambled eggs. The girl stretched in bed and smiled, remembering the events of the previous evening. It was Sebastian. He was preparing their breakfast. How marvelous and romantic it is. Before meeting her lover, Gwen looked into the bathroom. She washed her face, smoothed her hair, just a little so it wouldn't be noticeable, touched her lips with lipstick and pinched her cheeks, causing a slight blush. She wanted to appear before Sebastian in all her glory. He had indeed cooked scrambled eggs, and they were smoking in the pan. "Good morning," he smiled. "I've been tending to your place for a while. Is that all right?" "I was just hungry." "It's for the best." Gwen smiled radiantly. "Breakfast almost in bed. How romantic." "Well, let me take care of you." With these words, Sebastian took out a plate, deftly put a piece of scrambled eggs on it, sprinkled all this splendor with greens on top. Gwen watched his every move like a mesmerized woman. Her heart was beating joyfully in her chest. At last she met her man. And what a man! Beautiful, intelligent, attentive, caring. The young people ate breakfast in silence. Sebastian looked thoughtful. He was obviously thinking about something, and Gwen didn't want to distract him. "Thank you for the evening," he finally broke the silence. "I have to go. I have to stop by Norman's, pack my things, and get to the train station." Svetlana felt as if she'd been hit over the head with a sandbag. How come? Is he leaving already? And what about her? After all, they are so good, so cozy together. "You're leaving already?" "Yes, didn't I tell you?" Sebastian was surprised, and then suddenly he smiled his charming smile. "Yeah, well, we didn't have much time to talk last night." "I thought you were staying." "I would have stayed. You're great, really, but the train is in 3 hours and there's a lot to do." "Will I see you again?" Gwen fought hard against the tears coming to her eyes. She had already realized everything, guessed from Sebastian's look and his tone. It turned out to be an illusion of their feelings and sparks. Sebastian hadn't planned anything serious from the start. Gwen had invented an unearthly love and a fateful, chance meeting, and for him she was just another girl for a pleasant pastime, pleasant and not obliging to anything. Gwen didn't make a scene. She pulled herself together and gave herself an indifferent look. Let Sebastian guess nothing. Let him think that he was nothing more than a casual acquaintance for the evening. She didn't want to look pathetic in his eyes. Yes, Gwen cared what he thought of her, but Sebastian seemed to have noticed something. "Are you upset?" he asked sympathetically, and something like guilt seemed to flicker in his eyes. No, Gwen couldn't be angry with him. He hadn't promised her anything, hadn't lied to her. Now he seemed genuinely concerned for her. A little she smiled. "I thought we had at least another evening to spare." "You're wonderful." Sebastian kissed her on the top of the head. "If I had another day, I would have spent it with you. That's for sure, but I have to go. It was very nice to meet you." Sebastian left. He had his own life, his own plans. Already today he would be far, far away from Gwen, and probably in 2 or 3 days the guy would forget about this meeting. He was, Gwen realized now, Sebastian, not the kind of man who looked for a serious relationship. He likes to get acquainted with girls. The guy likes communication, adventure, admiration, and it's not his fault. Age is such, character, temperament. Besides, Sebastian did not lie to anyone, did not promise golden mountains. Gwen had chosen to spend the evening with him. Beatrice. She ran away when she realized what was going on. And she, Gwen, agreed to stay with Sebastian, and no regrets, by the way. Time passed. Life went back to normal. Gwen worked, met with friends, read, watched TV, and went to the cinema, went to visit her parents. All in all, she had a normal life. But now she often thought of Sebastian. She imagined how their relationship might have turned out. She also dreamed that he was out there in the big city, thinking of her too. Sebastian knows where she lives. Suddenly he would rush to her one day and say that he missed her, that he loved her, that he couldn't live without her. Of course, Gwen realized that this would never happen, but sweet dreams became so pleasant and light at heart that the girl did not deny herself in them. A month and a half later from that memorable meeting, Gwen suddenly realized that she was expecting a child. The thought pierced her like lightning right at work. One of the employees brought fish for lunch, and the smell coming from her plate, Gwen began to vomit. Yes, so much so that even in the eyes darkened. At first, Gwen tried to find an explanation for her situation. The cycle is disrupted. It's from nerves. After all, she had a hard time getting over the breakup with Sebastian, nausea, well, also from nerves, plus the results of dieting. Gwen wanted to lose weight, so often did not finish eating, although her appetite was excellent. But a few weeks passed, and ignoring the symptoms became pointless. Gwen went to the doctor, who confirmed her fears. Pregnancy is in its 3rd month. The decision had to be made quickly, either to give birth or to get rid of the fetus. But a couple more weeks, and it would be too late to abort. Gwen was in shock at the news. Not only was she really pregnant, but she had no time to think about it, and she couldn't tell anyone. On the one hand, Gwen really wanted to become a mother. Yes, with marriage did not work out, but what if this is her last chance? She is at an age when her peers are already in full possession of children. It's time for the most, and what if the interruption will put a cross on her motherhood in the future? It happens a lot. It's scary. And then, this is a child Sebastian, beautiful, intelligent, charming man. Gwen had never met anyone like that before. The best candidate for fathers and cannot think of no, of course, Sebastian will not participate in the life of the baby. He will not even know of his existence. What's the matter with him? They will never meet again, and yet such a gene pool. If the baby turns out to be as beautiful, it's a dream come true. Gwen felt she couldn't get rid of the baby. Even with the difficulties she faced, the fate of being a single mother is unenviable. But maybe being single, with no children at all, is even worse. In general, Gwen Pamamayavshiv several days in a row made a difficult decision for herself. She leaves the child and will try her best to give the baby a good childhood. She has a profession in her hands. Her parents, if anything, will definitely help. They are loving, reliable, so the baby to be. Having determined, Gwen felt inner peace and began, finally, to really enjoy life, fully developing under her heart. At this time, Kimberly, the younger sister, graduated from graduate school, received a scientific degree. Not only that, but she had been invited to work overseas for a major research company. It was something incredible in Gwen's eyes. Kimberly, her little sister, has made it this far. She has a dizzying career ahead of her, interesting work, recognition. And she, Gwen, will soon be a single mother. Her parents talked only about their youngest daughter's impending departure. They were proud of her, proud of Kimberly again, and had no idea that their eldest daughter would soon make them happy by being a single mother without 5 minutes. Against the backdrop of her sister's success, for which Gwen was certainly very happy, her own life seemed a complete failure. Kimberly was gone. She phoned her parents and sister, occasionally sending letters in which she enclosed photographs. Kimberly had changed. There was a hardness in her face that made her even more beautiful and attractive. Beautiful, smart, a dream simple, and Gwen had her own life going on. A few months passed, and it was impossible to hide the pregnancy. At work, about everything guessed, the boss was not particularly happy that one of his shaper goes on maternity leave. Now he picked on Gwen's work in every possible way and constantly hinted to her that she would not be waiting for her at work, because a single mother would always take sick leave. Who will work then? All this disturbed Gwen. She understood the case goes to dismissal, yes, pregnant employees, carefully protects the labor law, but you can always find loopholes. That's what the boss found one day. He simply closed the outlier, ceased to exist. Accordingly, all the female employees lost their jobs, but only for one day, because the firm went bankrupt only on paper. In fact, it continued to function without stopping. The very next day, the boss hired the dressmakers back to their former positions, all except Gwen. Pregnant employees, and then single mothers with a small child were unnecessary for the boss. Gwen was left without a job and without means of livelihood. She had no savings. She didn't even have money to pay her rent. Gwen had to go back to her parents in the village and confess everything to them. Mother and father, of course, surprised to hear the story of his daughter, but not particularly upset, even seemingly on the contrary. "Don't worry, we'll get through it," soothed her father, stroking Gwen's head like a little girl. "We will not lose, not those times." "Everything will be fine," echoed the mother. "You will give birth to a child, we will help to raise it. Children are happiness." The parents didn't seem to be bothered by the upcoming difficulties or the inevitable gossip of the neighbors. Gwen understood why this was, so they had a successful youngest daughter. Even Gwen's life mistakes paled in comparison to Kimberly's achievements. On the one hand, it made life easier for the future mother. On the other hand, it made her feel even more ridiculous and stupid. As always, against Kimberly's background, Gwen was losing badly. Frustrating, painful, but familiar. Gwen's son Kyle was born at the due date. The new mother spent hours looking at his wrinkled red face, trying to see the resemblance to Sebastian. She wanted the baby to look like his father. He was just as handsome, charming, charismatic. It didn't work. Kyle didn't have those deep turquoise eyes or the open smile that made dimples form on his cheeks. A boy like a boy, short, skinny, black-haired like his grandfather. Gwen was a little hurt that her son hadn't inherited his father's spectacular looks, but it didn't affect her feelings for the kid. Gwen adored Kyle. The first time she saw her baby, she realized that from now on all her actions, her whole life, everything would be only for his sake, for the sake of this little man. While Kyle was a baby, Gwen was supported by her parents, and how else? Payments from the state are minimal, no husband, no savings too. There's no job in sight. Who needs an employee with a baby in her arms? That's how parents fed their daughter an adored grandchild. Gwen herself didn't want to sit on their backs, so as soon as the opportunity arose, she took a job as a farm laborer in the cow barn. Kyle was too young for daycare. He was left in the care of his grandparents. They did not want to see him, and Gwen decided to work. After all, her baby needs the best toys, beautiful clothes, traveling. She accepted that Kyle was growing up without a father, but the boy should not be in need because of his own mother's carelessness. The work was hard and physically exhausting. You had to work double shifts to make a good wage, but at least Gwen had money. Now she went into the city with Kyle every weekend. They sat in cafes, went on rides, went to the cinema, and of course visited toy shops. Gwen often let her son choose what he wanted: an expensive radio-controlled car, an imported constructor, huge sets of soldiers. For the sake of this, Gwen literally bent her back at work. But most importantly, a happy gleam in the eyes of the only child. "You spoil him?" Sometimes shook his head. "Father, you cannot so. All for Kyle, you forget about yourself, and after all, young still quite." "I don't need anything." Gwen shrugged her shoulders. "The main thing is for my son to be happy." "Son," said the father. "Son should have learned to work by now. He won't wash his plate or clean his room. You and your grandmother do everything for him. You're raising a lazy boss. It's not good for a man." What are you?" Immediately joined loving grandmother. "Still has time to work. Let him enjoy his childhood." Gwen fully shared her mother's opinion and supported her. Father, on the arguments of women, only waved his hand and silently went out into the street. Sometimes he would say something like, "You can't be argued with." Gwen was irritated by her father's behavior, and it was only after 10 years that she realized how right he was. Blinded by her love for her only son, Gwen hadn't seen or noticed much, and now she was reaping the benefits. Kyle grew up a bright but lazy boy. At school, at first, he grasped everything quickly and was an excellent student without much difficulty. Gwen hoped he'd taken after Kimberly. She already held a post in the Scientific Academy, published in magazines. In general, was almost a celebrity, at least in scientific circles, certainly. But it was impossible to ride out all his school years on cleverness and memory. It was time to work, to teach, to delve into complex formulas, to make an effort. Kyle didn't want to do that at all, and problems began: twos, absences, unwillingness to go to this stupid school at all. Kyle gave a lot of arguments for the fact that in the modern world a person can get a good job and without education, and Gwen's heart was bleeding because her son was so untalented and stupidly ruining his abilities. The strict grandfather tried to educate his grandson, who had lost his hands. This time his mother and grandmother did not interfere with him. They kept aside, but it was too late. For Kyle, there were no authority figures anymore. The kid had gotten mixed up with a bad crowd. They were teenagers from not too well-off families. Gwen talked to her son a lot, tried to call him to order, but it was all in vain. Kyle was convinced that he knew best how to behave. "What can you teach me?" He questioned his mother. "You live in poverty. You don't have a decent education. You spend your life shoveling manure on the farm for pennies. Parents should bring up by example, by example, by example. You understand? I don't want to live like you. It's not much of an example. So I'm looking for other ways." Gwen had nothing to say to her rapidly growing son. All she could do was hope that everything would be all right with him. He'd grow up, he'd understand, he'd wise up. The year in which Kyle was to graduate from high school had brought Gwen many losses. First, just after New Year's Eve, her father left. He'd long had a strange cough and difficulty breathing. but wrote it off to the fact that he'd been a lifelong smoker. It turned out to be his heart. The heart attack happened in the morning. The ambulance did not even have time to bring the patient to the hospital. After his grandfather's death, Kyle went wild. The man, though elderly, had at least somehow restrained him, but now the guy had no breaks at all. He could spend nights out with his new friends, come home drunk and demand money from his mother and grandmother for fun. Kyle became rude, abrasive, a complete stranger. Neither persuasion nor threats worked on him. Gwen, who was still longing for her father, felt that she was losing her son, and only her mother gave her hope with her words that the boy would get over it. He is of such an age, he is growing up without a father. Nothing is difficult for him. He'll have to calm down. I've seen a lot of that in my time.
And indeed, by the middle of the year, Kyle had suddenly grown up. He'd just graduated high school, got his C grade. His grades were given only for his past merits, and thanks to his mother, who ran after the teachers and school administration with gifts at the end of the year.
Kyle suddenly seemed to appreciate that his mother and grandmother had done a lot for him, became more serious, even asked for forgiveness from his relatives. Gwen's heart sang, Mum was right. Kyle has changed as he's grown up. I decided to go to college, City College, to be a welder. It's a great trade, his mother and grandmother chorused in agreement. They would have been happy with any choice Kyle made. The main thing was that the boy realized the importance of education. He'd learn, he'd get a trade, he'd have a good, settled life. Kyle left, easily got into college, started an independent life in a college dormitory. Gwen breathed a sigh of relief. Everything seemed to be falling into place. And then a new blow. Her elderly mother fell ill on New Year's Eve, fever, cough. Nothing special, as if Gwen took care of her. Thought the usual seasonal cold, but the old woman became worse and worse. A doctor was called. He immediately heard wheezing in the lungs. Her mother was admitted to hospital, diagnosed with bilateral pneumonia. Gwen was tense, of course, but not too frightened. Inflammation of the lungs is a serious thing. Nothing to say. But Mum was in hospital, under the care of doctors. Gwen did not think about bad things, but one morning she got a call from the hospital with terrible news. Her mum was gone. She'd had a sudden seizure during the night, and that was it. That's how in just a year Gwen lost both parents, her support, help, reliable rear. The woman felt like she'd had her footing knocked out from under her. She was left alone in this cruel world. A complicated life and a troubled teenager, Kyle. How she wished Sebastian was there for her right now. Yes, she still remembered the father of her child with fondness and love. Gwen needed a solid shoulder to lean on in this difficult situation. But there was no such person, there just wasn't. Kimberly was far away. Of course she would come for a while to say goodbye to her mother, but she would immediately drift off into her own life. She has a bright, full of events, intense, and Sebastian that, of course, and does not remember Gwen. I wonder how his life turned out. Surely he is happily married, the other and cannot be, and brings up children, not even suspecting that somewhere there is another son, so in need of attention and care of his father. Time passed. Gwen was getting used to her new life. The son left to study in the city. The woman still worked double shifts to provide Kyle with everything he needed. The guy needed to dress, eat, pay for textbooks and extra classes, and still and walk a young man needs. It was the height of his college years, after all. When if not now, and life in the city is not cheap. The son has not yet worked, so the mother tried for the only child. She bent over backwards and transferred most of her wages to Kyle. She doesn't need much herself, does she? Kyle's a different story. His life was just beginning. The woman still wanted her only child to have everything she needed. If you brought a man into this world, you'd better provide for him. It was unusual to be alone in an empty house. No one to talk to, no one to discuss the news of the day. Kyle, what? They called each other, of course, almost every night. He answered his mother's questions by saying he was fine, always in a hurry to get somewhere. An understandable youth. Gwen did not take offense, but felt often lonely and abandoned. During this period of life, the woman began to look after Jonathan, a former classmate, already a widower. He worked as a driver for the administration. Once upon a time, Jonathan ran after Gwen with flowers and compliments. It was in school. He was funny, insecure, ridiculous, anxious, and touching. Then young Gwen dreamed of other guys like Sebastian, handsome, stylish, smart. And Jonathan, he was too simple, short, puny, and wearing glasses. Of course, Gwen was pleased by the boy's attention, which, needless to say, pleased her ego, but nothing serious was out of the question.
Time passed. Jonathan had grown from an awkward teenager into a rather nice man and had married Sharon, a girl a grade below him. Gwen had been friends with her as a child. They were not close friends, but they often went out together, talked, shared secrets.
Jonathan and Sharon's family turned out to be exemplary, both quiet, hardworking, polite. It was hard to imagine either of them raising their voices at their spouse or children. Gwen was happy for her childhood friends. They had 2 heirs, a son and a daughter, as if by order. Parents raised their children, worked, went to the sea every summer. A house full of wealth, love, prosperity. Gwen, who was pulling her son without a husband, smiled at the happy couple. She was happy for Jonathan and Sharon, and a little envious of them. That would be the kind of family she wanted to build, preferably with Sebastian, but it didn't work out. But Jonathan and Sharon's happiness was short-lived. The young and seemingly healthy Sharon suddenly fell ill. She was fading, pale, thin, and weak. Jonathan took his wife to hospitals, trying to help her. They found the cause, of course, but what good was it? Some complex genetic disease that had been dormant for some time had made its debut. Doctors had given disappointing prognoses that differed by only a couple of months. Sharon could not be helped. In the end, Jonathan was left alone with 2 children in his arms. True, the son and daughter were already old enough, but still the hopeless widower was supported by the whole village. Gwen at first also cooked dinners for the orphan of the family, and then the man came to his senses and took over the household. So slowly he raised a son and a daughter. He put the children on their feet, educated them. Both were already working and living in the city. But Jonathan did not hurry to move closer to the heirs. He had elderly parents in the village, so he looked after them. When Kyle left for school, Gwen began to notice that Jonathan was around more and more often, walking her home from work, talking about this and that, or helping her carry her bags from the shop. It was as if he happened to come across her path every now and then. Gwen didn't mind the pleasant company. They discussed the news, remembered their childhood, laughed. One day Gwen invited Jonathan to tea. The man met her from work as usual and walked her to the gate. The man agreed, and at the table Jonathan finally decided to have a serious conversation. It was obvious that this step was not easy for him. "Gwen, I've always liked you, you know that." "Well, when was that?" Gwen smiled. She hadn't realized what Jonathan was getting at. She thought they were just reminiscing about their childhood again. It had been a long time ago. Jonathan agreed, and then he looked at her seriously and added, "But nothing has changed since then." Gwen looked at the man questioningly. She didn't know what to say, but the feeling from this unexpected confession was clearly pleasant. Goosebumps ran up and down her spine, and her heart warmed. "I've been fond of you since childhood, since the 6th grade. I made up my mind to admit it in high school, but you refused me then. I pretended that I didn't care. It didn't work out. And it didn't work out, but in fact I suffered then. I can't describe it. I looked at you secretly, admired you, was jealous if any of the guys were around, and dreamed that when I graduated from school I would study, become rich, and come to pick you up in a cool car. Then you wouldn't be able to resist." Gwen smiled. The confession seemed naive and very sweet. Jonathan smiled too, remembering his young and ambitious self. "But it didn't work out," he continued. "I didn't manage to go to university. I didn't have enough brains. I learned to be a driver and returned to the village. Of course, I learned about you from my acquaintances. They said you lived in the city. They said you had a boyfriend. Well, I didn't doubt it. A pretty girl like you, how could she not have admirers? They'd be queuing up." Gwen couldn't help it and laughed out loud. Jonathan, living here in the village, thought that she was surrounded by a crowd of suitors, while Gwen suffered from loneliness and was desperately jealous of her married friends. "Oh, you have no idea how wrong you were." "Yes, you fool, I was young." Jonathan grinned. "Anyway, I decided that the train had finally left. You are in the city, you have a rich fiancé, gives you gifts, no need to check, and I suffered and felt my own inadequacy. Who was I? An ordinary driver, and you're a princess, a queen. an unattainable ideal. No match for me. Jonathan was in almost physical pain at the time. The girl he had been in love with since childhood would never be his. At that time, it seemed that there was nothing to live for. The guy worked and ate, met with friends. The world was gray and faded. Everything seemed meaningless, and then suddenly it turned out that the neighbor's daughter, Sharon, was partial to him, to Jonathan. It was an amazing discovery for the boy. Someone could love him for who he was, not too handsome, not too successful. Sharon had gone from skinny Sherry, an ungainly teenager, to a sweet girl. Big clear eyes, thick long hair, thin waist. Sharon graduated from teachers' college in the city and returned to her home in the small town. She taught school now, tutoring first graders. She walked briskly up to Jonathan on his way home from work that evening. She spotted her neighbor at the gate and told him to his face how she felt. I was stunned then. It was unexpected, and I felt sorry for her because I was in the same situation. I knew how much she hoped for my attention, and I knew how much she would be hurt by my indifference. How could I do that to a fragile Sharon in love? Anyway, Jonathan and Sharon started dating, getting to know each other, and realizing every day that they were a wonderful couple. I thought that nothing good was going to happen in my life, Jonathan said. Sharon. It was as if she pulled me out of my cocoon and showed me that happiness was still possible. Jonathan and Sharon married and had children. And then you came back to the village, confused with a belly. I wanted to be your rock, your support, but it was too late. Sharon and I got married, we had babies. Did you still love me then? Gwen wondered. Of course. And now I love you too, but I couldn't show my feelings then. And I already had obligations to Sharon and the children. I loved all three of them very much already, and I couldn't betray my family even for my own happiness. Were you unhappy? Gwen was surprised. Jonathan's revelations had shaken her to the core. I can't say. Sharon was wonderful. I loved her in my own way. I cared for her. I was happy with her. But with you, I can't even now describe how I felt about you, and I still do. They sat for a while longer. Jonathan looked at Gwen, waiting for some sign from her. The woman, she didn't realize her own feelings. She was pleased that there was a man who loved her so much. A warmth developed on her soul from it. After the death of her parents, Gwen was left all alone. A son in town, a sister abroad. There were no people to care for Gwen, to try to please her, to take an interest in her well-being, after all. And then there was Jonathan, in love, devoted, good, reliable. But something was stopping Gwen. Kyle. How would he feel about this turn of events? I'm sure he won't approve. He'll say that her mother is crazy. In her old age, she's having an affair. Only the desire to be with not indifferent person. It gradually overcame. Gwen often thought about how good it would be if they lived together. Jonathan would be happy. That's for sure. And how nice it was to know that you could make someone so happy. Anyway, that night, the former classmates decided to give it a go. To try being a couple. Well, I'll ask you out tomorrow, Jonathan summarized with a smile. The dream of my youth will finally come true. It will come true. Gwen nodded deliberately. The next day they went into the city. They wandered around the park, talked, sat in cafes, and then went to the cinema. During the show, Jonathan took Gwen's hand and held it for an hour and a half, until the film was over. The woman didn't mind. She liked the feeling. At last she wasn't alone. A week later, Jonathan moved in with her. Immediately he fixed the long leaking tap, tightened the hinges on all the interior doors. They were finally creak-free, and Gwen started cooking again. She was too lazy to do it for herself, but now Jonathan was with her, and the woman pleased him with delicious dishes. The only question on Gwen's mind was, how will Kyle feel about all this? He didn't know yet, did he? The son rarely came to visit his mother. They talked on the phone more and more. So Gwen was holding back, not telling Kyle about the changes that had taken place in her life. Jonathan, he immediately informed both his son and daughter. Gwen realized they were happy for their father. The woman wished her own son's reaction would be the same, but there was little hope of that. Several years passed. Gwen still hadn't decided to have a serious conversation with her son. It wasn't hard to hide the details of her personal life. Her son had little interest in what was going on with his mother. He usually only called to ask for money. But one day Kyle did come. It was amazing. It had been a long time since the son had graced his mother with his presence, and now he showed up. Hi, Gwen was both excited and a little confused. Jonathan hadn't come home from work yet, but his things were everywhere. It was impossible not to notice that someone else was living in the house. Hi, Kyle said glumly. He didn't look too shabby, pale, worried. I need money. Gwen knew immediately that something serious had happened. What's going on, she asked, clutching at her heart. Something stabbing in her chest. Is there something wrong with school? I haven't studied in a while, Kyle mumbled under his breath. How? Like this. I got expelled for truancy. I've been working hard, and I can't get money from you. I sent you most of my salary every month, Gwen reminded him. It wasn't money for the city. It was nothing. Kyle sighed. I didn't have enough. So I did the best I could. Other people's parents are well off. They have cars, flats, and money for entertainment. I felt like a beggar all the time. Do you think that's nice? Gwen was hurt to hear these words. She'd spent her whole life working hard for her son. She wanted Kyle to have the best of everything, and now it turns out he feels miserable. It turns out Gwen's not doing her job as a parent, and Kyle's even out of college. So what now? Gwen asked. I got into debt. Kyle explained. I wanted to start a business to raise money, and I ended up in debt. They're charging me a lot of money, threatening to kill me. Where am I going to get it? So I came to you for help. Son, you know I don't have anything. What do you mean, you don't have anything? Kyle was surprised. What about this house? What do you want us to do? Sell the house? Well, what's the solution, Mom? I'll pay off my debts, we'll rent a flat together, we'll live in the city. Why? Are you going to take a well-deserved holiday soon? There's no couch in town, of course, but I'll get you a job in an outlier. My grandmother told me that you used to be a dressmaker, and now this labor pays well. We'll live together in the city. You and me like we used to be. Wouldn't that be nice? Gwen couldn't agree with her son. A couple of years ago, she would have happily supported Kyle's idea. Living alone in an empty house was unbearable, but now that she had Jonathan, they were good together. It was nice to have a loving, understanding person around. So what now? Kyle finally noticed the men's things in the rooms. Jonathan's jacket hung on the wall, his trousers were on the chair, and his size 43 trainers were by the front door. What's that? Kyle asked, looking at his mother in amazement. Did you have someone? I've been wanting to tell you for a long time. I've had this happen here. I see he shook his head and sighed sadly. You're getting on with your life. Yes, of course you don't have a son to worry about. You know I'm not. Gwen objected softly. She could see that Kyle was depressed and troubled. He needed help, and she, the mother, would certainly lend her shoulder to him in his time of need. Who else would? Son, I'll do whatever you say. And Gwen did. She sold the house, gave most of the proceeds to her son. Used the rest to buy a tiny flat on the outskirts of town, in an old house. Jonathan, he'd suggested options, wanted to give Kyle into his savings. There was less than he needed, but it still turned out to be a fairly decent amount. Gwen didn't agree. Jonathan shouldn't have to solve her problems, their problems. He had children of his own. Using a man in this situation is despicable. Stay with me, Jonathan pleaded with her. Gwen had already packed her things at that time. The suitcases stood in the hay and waited for tomorrow morning. Kyle had booked a taxi for his mother by 10 a.m. You know I can't. I know, but I don't understand. You gave him money, you bought him a place to live, but why would you want to be there? Stay with me. I've got a big house, plenty of room, you know. We had a good time together, didn't we? We were. Gwen agreed. Yes, in the few years that they had lived with Jonathan, the woman had become accustomed to warmth, care, acceptance. It was very pleasant. They would go out together in the evenings, discuss things. Jonathan looked at Gwen with loving eyes and she felt happy, but now everything was different. Gwen saw that her son was not well, too anxious, too restless. There was clearly something not good going on in his life. Yes, Kyle is an adult. Jonathan is partly right when he says that he should deal with his own problems. But when Gwen was in a difficult situation, she didn't deal with her own problems. Her parents had helped her a lot. Jonathan assured her that it was a different story. A young, single woman with a baby in her arms and a grown man who had been given money from the sale of her house by her mother. Gwen couldn't agree with him. It's fine for him to talk. He's got both his son and daughter retired, working good jobs with families. There was no telling how Jonathan would sing if one of his children was in a situation like Kyle's. And Gwen was also elementally afraid of losing her last place to live. Now that she didn't have the home she had spent her childhood in, the woman began to worry about old age. It wouldn't be long before she would be elderly and possibly helpless. How would she be without a corner of her own if Kyle couldn't be looked after? I mean, he's going to lose that flat in the old building too. Anyway, we need to find out what's going on in his life. Maybe it's time to save his son. He himself will not confess, but when they start living together, Gwen will understand everything, will see everything herself. She cannot leave her only child alone with his problems and troubles. Why are you so worried? Gwen smiled at Jonathan. The smile came out sad, the woman realized, even without a mirror. I'm not moving to the moon or even to another continent. The city is near. Distance is not an obstacle to feelings. We'll meet, communicate. Of course we will, Jonathan sighed. But you know it's not the same thing. What can you do? It's just the way life is. Gwen moved to the city and started to organize her new home with enthusiasm. There was only one room in the flat, and it went, of course, to Kyle, and Gwen settled in the kitchen. She bought a cot, which she put by the window at night and put away in the pantry in the morning. Jonathan, he came often at first. They walked along the seafront as before, sat in cafes. With him, Gwen felt invaluable, important, loved, not like at home. Jonathan urged her to move in with him. Well, you do not want to come to me. Let's go somewhere else, rent a flat, start life anew, try. But Gwen couldn't leave her son now. After living with him for a while, the woman realized Kyle had a serious drinking problem. He drank a lot, came home in the morning. His mother did not sleep, worried about what could happen to a drunken son at such a time, beat someone or hit by a car, or even taken to the police. Then, strange as it may sound, Gwen got used to it. Kyle's nocturnal escapades no longer bothered her so much, they became routine. Her son would sleep until dinner, and then he would be sick, and then the caring mother would bring her son pills in time, give him mineral water, clean up after him. Without her, he probably won't survive. Because the disease progressed, Kyle drank more and more and degraded literally before her eyes, becoming stupid, aggressive, helpless. Gwen blamed herself. Who else could she blame? It was her fault that Kyle's childhood had been spent without a father. What is it like for a child, especially a boy, to grow up without a male example in front of his eyes and without a father's care? And Kyle was born to a man Gwen didn't know at all. Maybe that handsome Sebastian was an alcoholic or one of his relatives? Gwen thought that addiction to alcohol was often passed down through genes, and now Kyle was suffering because of his careless, stupid mother. Gwen tried her best to make her son's existence easier, feeding him on her own money and generally becoming a servant for Kyle. He did nothing at all around the house, only demanded. Gwen realized that Kyle didn't hold down any jobs because of his drinking habits. Of course, who wants an employee who can go on a bender at any time? Before the man started living with his mother, he was still trying to get his head round, and then he relaxed. Indeed, why bother if you are not going to be hungry anyway? His mother bought groceries and cooked delicious lunches and dinners of several dishes. Kyle didn't bother to work. After a while, the son began to demand money from his mother when he did not have enough for a drink, and it happened quite often because the man earned a living by rare part-time jobs, which were not every day. The soul demanded hot drinks on a regular basis. Gwen, feeling sorry for her son, at first gave him money for pocket money, and then she tried to stop giving him money, but Kyle still took her relative's money. Sometimes he slowly took money out of his mother's purse, Sometimes he got his way by threats and rudeness. Gwen felt miserable and confused. Life with her own son had become a nightmare. Kyle could yell at his mother, sass her at the drop of a hat. He took her money, so the woman tried, having received payment, immediately make a stock of food for a long time. The adult son had not yet raised his hand on his elderly parent, but looking into Kyle's empty, embittered eyes, Gwen realized that the moment was not far off. The only outlet for Gwen was walks with Jonathan. He still visited her in town whenever he could. The woman didn't tell him about her life. It was embarrassing, hard, and she couldn't share it with anyone. In front of others, Gwen put on the mask of a prosperous and quite happy woman. One day, Jonathan gave Gwen news that made her heart ache. "I'm moving soon," he said, looking away. "We won't be able to see each other much." Unfortunately, where Gwen gasped. Lately, she'd only felt human around Jonathan, and now it looked like their meetings were about to end. "To the sea, to Florida," he answered. "With my son's family. You know I have lung problems. The doctor advised me to change the climate otherwise. Well, never mind. My son decided to move with me too. My daughter is still thinking about it, but it looks like she'll decide too. So that's it." "Oh, that's a shame." Gwen was upset. She tried to fight the tears that came treacherously to her eyes. "I'm really going to miss you. Gwen, I'm begging you so much, come with me. You helped your son to solve problems when he was in a difficult situation. Now he will swim out on his own and not a little one in you. We will live by the sea. Just imagine what happiness it is. Think about it." Gwen realized that she wouldn't go anywhere. How would she leave her son? Jonathan just didn't know anything about Kyle's addiction, or the fact that he hadn't been earning much for a long time. Without his mother, Kyle would be lost, completely lost. And how could she enjoy the sea, the sun, and the company of a loving Jonathan, knowing that her son was dying alone in a distant city? Jonathan was gone. Gwen took his absence hard. They called each other, corresponded of course. Jonathan sent pictures of marvelous landscapes and still called Gwen to him. He described how good they would be together, but the woman felt responsible for her son. She gave birth, did not give the appropriate upbringing, so she should be near, help, support. Sometimes because of these thoughts the woman felt terrible, but she could not do anything about it. A few more years passed. Gwen had grown old. She probably could have looked better and younger, but not with this life. Kyle continued to drink and adamantly refused treatment. He started taking company home, and it was much harder than when Gwen waited nights for her son. These people, marginal-looking women, downcast men, laughed loudly in Kyle's room, drank, swore, even fought sometimes. When Gwen tried to reason with her son, he snapped at her. He stopped seeing his mother as a person altogether, and then Marion, Kyle's common-law wife, showed up at the flat. There was no hope that she would have a positive effect on her son. Marion was a drinker herself. While Kyle usually didn't touch his mother, except when he needed money, Marion clung to Kyle's mother on and off. Eventually, she'd managed to turn Kyle against Gwen, too. He was now convinced that his mother intended to break him up with his beloved and hated Marion in general. Scolding, quarrels, scandals, all this now waited for Gwen every day, and her son was not saved, and with Jonathan, personal happiness did not build, but could now live with a man who loved her all her life on the beach. It's a fairy tale. But what about Kyle, without her supervision? No, she gave a man life. She's got to take responsibility for him now. I guess that's her lot in life. The rain had eased considerably, and Gwen took advantage of the respite to get to the driveway. This time she was in a hurry, in case it rained again. She couldn't wait to get back, but she had nowhere to go. Looks like Marion and Kyle are having company again tonight. They'll be hanging out in the only room till morning, and they'll be going to the kitchen to the fridge. Gwen's just about to fill it up with groceries, which will be great. Tomorrow we'll probably have to go to the shop again, if there's any money left. Gwen will lie on her cot all night, pretending to sleep, and listen to the sounds of the merry party in the next room. Her main task now is not to disturb her son, Marion, and their guests. When she reached her floor on foot, as there had never been a lift in this old house, the old woman stopped at the door like a stumbling block. On the landing were her suitcases, the same ones she'd moved here with from the village. Gwen opened one of them. There lay her belongings, nothing incomprehensible. The woman tried to open the door with her key, no luck. Someone had snapped the lock so it wouldn't open from the outside. So Gwen knocked loudly. The bell hadn't worked for a long time. The door swung open, and there stood Marion, happy, arms at her sides, feet shoulder-width apart. She was smiling strangely. "What's the matter?" Gwen asked. "You're moving out," you old hag, Marion said in a luscious voice. "This is my flat. Why would I want to leave?" "It's not yours, it's Kyle's, it's registered to him. I saw the paperwork myself the other day. You're a nobody, so get out of here." Kyle's head peeked out from behind Marion. "Yeah, Mum, we've decided that you need to leave. You don't give us a life, you're always sticking your nose in our business, giving us advice. And you're trying to get Marion and me to break up, so we'd better get our own place." "And what are you going to live on?" Gwen did not understand. She has long realized that her son does not have any warm feelings for her, but he needed his mother at least as a source of funding. "You don't know anything." Marion smirked. "I'm expecting a baby I'm due in a couple of months. I've already got sick pay, maternity pay, and then every month for the baby, so we're in the clear." Gwen looked at her sister-in-law's figure. Yes, her belly did stand out under the dirty sweatshirt, but Marion had never been particularly slim, so the woman didn't notice anything. "That's news to me. Kyle and Marion are having a baby, poor baby. What's it like growing up with parents like that? And will that baby even survive?" Gwen's eyes darkened at the news. The news of the baby overshadowed even the fact that she was being kicked out of her own home. She felt unbearably sorry for this unborn baby, grandson or granddaughter. At the same time, the woman realized that she was unable to save him, to make his life even a little easier. She would have to deal with her own fate. "So get out of here," Marion smiled again. "Son, where am I supposed to go?" Gwen turned to Kyle. "You can't live on the street. You have a lover in the village, go to him." Kyle waved her off carelessly. "You've got somewhere to go. Don't be poor." Of course, Kyle didn't know that Jonathan had moved to Florida, but he'd never been interested in his mother's affairs. "And you have a rich sister. She won't leave you," Marion added and slammed the door shut. Gwen picked up her suitcases and went outside. What else could she do? She had no idea where to go. Jonathan was far away, Sister Kimberly even farther away. No one wanted her, alone, abandoned. Now she was homeless. She must have deserved it somehow. "I'm ashamed to even tell people I know how life has turned out." Native son, for whom her mother only lived and kicked out of the house. Gwen walked for a long time wherever she looked. The rain had stopped, but there was a piercing icy wind. It burned her cheeks and made her eyes water. It was darkening rapidly. There were hardly any people on the streets. Gwen was finally exhausted. She put her suitcases near an empty bus stop, sat on them, and let the tears flow. They poured down her cheeks, and the woman didn't even wipe her face. She wept for her unfulfilled hopes for her son. She wept for Kyle's plight and her unborn grandson. Well, and her own future, of course, caused anxiety and apprehension. Where to go, who to ask for help. Staying outside on a cold November night is a pleasure. "What's the matter with you?" A pleasant young girl's voice came from somewhere behind her. Gwen turned round sharply. A young woman was looking at her. Tall, skinny, tight jeans, trainers, a deep hooded sweatshirt and eyes, attentive, sympathetic eyes. Next to the stranger, a small, funny-looking pug was worrying. He whined amusingly and seemed to be looking at Gwen with sympathy too. His alien, sympathetic face looked so funny that the older woman couldn't help but smile through her tears. Rachel was born into a student family. Her mom was an economist, her dad an engineer. The young parents met at a student disco. They immediately noticed each other, then fell in love and got married. Rachel was born when both were in their 4th year, each at their own university. The young family was not discouraged. Yes, they earned little. Yes, they had to live with a child in a cramped room in the student dormitory, but ahead of the couple had so much. They dreamed, planned, hoped. Rachel did not remember her parents at all, saw their photos, listened to the stories of relatives and acquaintances about these people. That's how the image of her mother and father formed in her head. Cheerful, energetic, working, a little naive, loving each other and the child. Tragedy struck at a construction site. Rachel's mother and father, trying to earn an extra penny after their studies and main job, were looking for a part-time job. That time they managed to get a job with a private contractor who was building a sports complex in the city center. Young spouses together with a couple of similar students painted the walls. And something happened. Either the cable broke or the platform failed. All in all four of them fell from a height right onto the concrete floor. No one survived. There was no chance. The owner of the construction site managed to get away with it. The students worked for him unofficially, and he made it look as if the young people had sneaked into his construction site to take extreme photos or something like that. A friend of her parents, the family's dormitory neighbor, was babysitting little Rachel at the time. The girl spent a few days with her. Then she was supposed to be taken to an orphanage, but her father's sister, Aunt Scarlett, turned up. She lived in the country, raising her 3 children alone. She wasn't poor, but her family wasn't exactly wealthy. An extra mouth in the form of a niece orphaned overnight was a burden to Aunt Scarlett. But what could she do? What would people say? Abandoned her brother's daughter, sent the child to an orphanage. The neighbors will turn on her. They'll remember it for the rest of their lives, and their conscience will bother them. That's how Rachel ended up with Aunt Scarlett's family. The girl's childhood was, at first glance, the most ordinary. Rachel helped her aunt with the household chores, along with her children. She played outside, went to school with her friends, but no birthdays with a lot of friends and a cake with candles, no new beautiful dresses, trips to the amusement park. And what is their dresses? Rachel lacked the banal warmth hugs, affectionate words of support. Aunt Scarlett was not strict or angry, but she was not in a hurry to surround her nephew with love and care. Aunt Scarlett looked at them differently, stroked their heads, hugged them, and found tender words for them. Rachel, she always felt like a stranger to her aunt, and as she grew older she realized she was a burden to Aunt Scarlett. Growing up with the realization of her own irrelevance was hard. The girl sometimes felt sorry for Aunt Scarlett. She was so tired at work and with her own children, and then her niece fell on her head. Rachel dreamed of growing up and having a family of her own. There she would be loved and appreciated for real. Rachel always spent a lot of time studying. Firstly, she liked to learn new things, and the girl did it well. She was an excellent student all the years. Secondly, Rachel understood that education is her only chance for a prosperous life. The girl wanted to leave the village, to settle in the city, to travel the world. For all this she needed money, so she tried. After school, Rachel entered the university as a translator. She was given a dormitory, and her free life began. At last, she wasn't a burden to anyone. Rachel did not pay attention to boys in her youth. She firmly decided for herself, first her career, then everything else, but in the last year of her studies she accidentally met Oliver. He was 8 years older. An accomplished, self-confident, handsome, intelligent man stopped by the university to talk to the rector. Oliver had his own travel agency. He needed intelligent interpreters, and they bumped into each other near the rector's office. Literally bumped into each other. Oliver swung the doors open and took a step into the corridor and crashed into Rachel, who was walking past. The man immediately picked the girl up, preventing her from falling, and began to apologize. Rachel assured him with a smile that she was fine, amused by the man's consternation. He acted as if he hadn't accidentally hit her with his shoulder, but had almost hit her with a car, and then, like a corny scene from a novel, their eyes met, and Rachel's breath caught. Oliver felt something too. There was a spark between the young people. Anyway, they went to the window and talked for a long time. They exchanged phone numbers, of course, and in the evening he picked Rachel up and they went for a walk around the city. The girl herself chose such a format of the first date. Rachel-Oliver's relationship, Rachel-Oliver, quickly became close and very serious. Soon the girl moved to his flat, a spacious 3-room flat in the city center. At first the girl was frightened and confused by the fact that her chosen one is so rich. He has his own travel agency, a beautiful car, an expensive flat. And she is a girl from the village, without a yard even her parents do not have. An orphan from Kazan, but Oliver was not embarrassed by all this. He looked at Rachel with admiring eyes, showered her with gifts and compliments. The girl saw that her very presence made him happy and finally allowed herself to just be happy and not worry about anything. After a while, Rachel realized that she was expecting a child. She was confused, of course, because everything was too quick and unplanned. Oliver was genuinely happy. His business was doing well, his capital was increasing, and his business was developing. Children are happiness, the man smiled, stroking Rachel's still quite flat tummy. Rachel thought that after the news of her pregnancy, Oliver would finally propose to her, but he was in no hurry to propose. When she herself asked him about it when they would legitimize their relationship, Oliver was genuinely surprised. Why would that be? Well, as the child should have a full family, mom, dad. Ah, that, the child I recognize legally, do not doubt, and the stamp in the passport. These are such conventions. You know, I was married, and the relationship went sour just after the official marriage. Then there was so much trouble with reissuing documents and so on. So I'm against such conventions. The statement of her beloved then shook Rachel, but she coped with herself and accepted Oliver's point of view. Indeed, it does not matter whether there is a stamp in the passport, the main thing that they love each other. Catherine was born on her due date and made Rachel the happiest person on earth. The young mom couldn't look at her daughter and didn't understand where such a miracle had come from. Oliver was not a very attentive father. In general, since the birth of the child, he became somehow distant. Only Rachel, blinded by the new happiness of motherhood, did not immediately notice it. One day, Catherine was then only 2 years old. The man said that he was leaving. I leave the flat to my daughter. I will support her all her life and communicate with the child too. But with you, I can no longer live. I'm sorry, I fell out of love. I met someone else. It happens. Oliver left, leaving Rachel in upset feelings. She felt like half her heart had been ripped out of her chest. She'd loved Oliver so much, she'd hoped they'd be okay. She had to adjust to the new reality. Oliver wasn't lying. He left the flat to his daughter and correctly transferred the alimony for her maintenance. But the woman understood that she had to urgently find a source of income. Oliver's money, they were only for the daughter. Rachel needs to work, need to be in the profession. As practice showed, in this life, one has to rely only on oneself. Rachel realized that in general she was still very lucky. Oliver left his daughter a flat and remitted child support. It was a small amount of money, but it was still a pain in her chest. The pain of the breakup was not going away, and the future seemed very vague. It is necessary to go to work, but it so happened that Rachel immediately after university gave birth to a daughter and therefore did not have time to get a job, and now with a small child in her arms, and without experience, who needs her? Rachel has no relatives, no mom, no sister, no grandmother, no one who could look after Catherine while her mother is at work. Send the child to a kindergarten, but Catherine will be sick a lot there. The employer is unlikely to like an employee who does not get out of sick leave. The situation seemed hopeless. That November evening, Rachel was just thinking about her future. She was thinking about how she could get a job. There was not enough money to live on. She had to deny herself everything. She couldn't and wouldn't ask Oliver for more money. He left them a whole flat and gives them money to support their daughter. And if Rachel couldn't provide for herself, it was her problem. She's not a child anymore, she's an adult. At this point, Princess, the pug that Oliver had given Rachel once, when everything was still good with them, the dog was asking to go outside. What a bad time. It's dark and cold and there are puddles all around. The rain had recently let up, but where to go? Princess can't wait. Catherine has already slept in her room. She will wake up only in the morning. So Rachel can calmly walk the dog. The girl quickly dressed, attached the collar at Princess' leash, and went out into the straight November evening. The old woman sitting on the suitcases near the bus stop Rachel noticed from afar and could not believe her eyes. It looked too strange. She approached and looked closely and realized that the old woman was very upset about something. She was crying quietly, not even noticing that her face was already wet with tears. Rachel's heart squeezed with pity for a stranger who was obviously in great distress. "What's wrong? Do you need help?" When she heard Gwen's story, Rachel was horrified. She had longed for a mother, for a close relative. She couldn't imagine how Kyle could do this to her mum, her own mum. Rachel hadn't hesitated for a second in making that offer. The words came out of her mouth before she had a chance to think them through. "Come to my place now, you're very cold. You need a mug of hot tea, you can't stay outside." A year had passed since that meeting. Gwen went to live with Rachel. On that cold, dark evening, over a cup of hot tea, a decision was formed that suited both parties to the unusual story. Gwen now looked after the house and enjoyed chatting with Catherine, who loved her new grandmother. Rachel calmly went to work, knowing that her little girl was in safe and loving hands. Next to Rachel, finally there was a person who loved and cared for her, Gwen. And she was getting the maternal warmth she had missed all her life. But her daughter now had a wonderful grandmother who would entertain, feed, and teach. Kyle showed up. One day he found out somehow where his mother lived. He demanded Gwen come home, appealed to her sense of family. "What, you care about strangers more than your own son?" "It happens." Gwen shook her head. "I know that now. Sometimes strangers are closer than family, and Rachel and I aren't strangers anymore." Kyle kicked Marion out. Their baby was never born. Marion, being pregnant, was not going to give up her bad habits, so naturally her body couldn't take it anymore. The baby was born prematurely. It was a very weak and painful boy. He did not survive. Plans of the parents of the unfortunate crumb on the allowance from the state hit a snag, so Kyle came crawling to his mother. He needed her money again. He still didn't want to work. But this time, Gwen was firm. No. Jonathan was right. Her son was a grown man. She'd done more than she could for him. She'd sold her only home so he could buy a flat in the city and pay his debts. Let him take it from there. Speaking of Jonathan, Gwen did tell him her story. She got over herself, she was immediately relieved, and Jonathan finally understood her. He came to Gwen's house, met Rachel and Catherine. All four of them got along very well. It was a nice group of people, heartfelt. Catherine even began to call Jonathan grandfather, but he did not object. On the contrary, it was obvious that he enjoyed it. "I invite all three of you to visit me this summer," Jonathan said before leaving. "No refusal is accepted." "No refusal is planned." Gwen smiled. Jonathan left. Summer is coming. Rachel and Gwen are making plans for a wonderful holiday in Florida, with Jonathan and his whole family waiting for them. It's going to be a wonderful holiday, and who knows, maybe they'll move to Florida during the holidays and see what's what. Rachel's going to try and get a job and have a holiday and get to know the area. They could do it. And why? Living by the sea, surrounded by people you love and love you, isn't that happiness? Amber considered herself as much a part of these places as the dry air that smelled of wormwood, or the huge stones that broke through from the walls of an ancient fortress. Where else? On these stones. She'd been born here, true, not really, but closer to the sea. But their family had moved to this small town when Amber had just started walking. And in 18 years, the girl had become flesh of his flesh. It was a purely female family. No, of course, her grandmother had once had a husband, but Amber no longer remembered her grandfather. He had died long ago, before she was born. She had a father, too. And he was the one she remembered, and she loved him very much. But he couldn't find a job that would allow his family to live in relative poverty. So he took a job as a shift worker, flying across the country every month, far beyond the Rocky Mountains. Mom began patching holes after years of being broke. The family needed everything from new bedding to replace dilapidated ones to coats and boots for growing Amber. Dad loved the West. He told stories of bright summer nights casting tin, of funny coyotes, of moss falling underfoot in the swamps when he went huckleberry picking. But Dad had not only found his place in life, he'd also found a soulmate, someone named Lauren, who worked for him as a cook. He never came back with Lauren. Lauren had her own apartment in Sacramento, and out west, they were given a room in a dormitory for shift workers. Her father continued to send money for Amber, probably most of his Western earnings. Amber didn't want to touch them. Some call it adolescent maximalism, others call it the kind of mental purity that only comes from youth. Amber demanded the transfers be sent back. She didn't want to be tied to this man from the moment he cheated until the end of her days. The blow was stronger, for she was very attached to her father. The only daughter, used to thinking she was the most favorite. Her mother was lost, looking from Amber to her grandmother for guidance. If Amber wanted to mentally picture her mom, The first thing that came to mind was her always scared and unsure look. "You don't want the money, don't take it." "You're right," Grandma said calmly, and made a sign to her daughter. "Temmie, leave her alone." "I know it's going to be hard on Mom." Amber knew what her family was thinking. "I'm going to work. There are different ways to live." "Better, worse," Grandma said. "We'll adjust. But remember about Mom, she has poor health." When the women were alone, Grandma told her daughter, "Make an account in Amber's name and put the money in that account. We'll get by somehow. The girl's conscience will be clear. If she wants to someday, and will return to his father every penny, and you can safely look into the eyes of John." Sometimes husbands tell their ex-wives they're living off their alimony. "And if, God forbid, I die, that money will come in handy for Amber when she's an adult." Amber didn't know about the second part of the plan and stoically accepted the fact that their little family had the bare necessities. Her mom worked at the library, and she loved books so much that she sometimes brought them back from the dumpster. That was a trend lately. People threw away books, sometimes their own, sometimes inherited from the older generation. After all, anything could be found on the internet. Why clutter up the house with dusty tomes? Mom brought books in dirty bags, or just holding them to her chest. Their own library had grown so large that some of it had moved into the guest house in the garden. But the library paid pennies, and my mother wrote term papers and theses for students in the evenings. Behind each work was a specific goal. Things were bought the cheapest, and still ahead loomed a long list of things that could not do without, and every item on that list was a mom's sleepless night. Amber was used to not asking for anything for herself, not even a refill at the table. Too often lunch was cooked for 2 or 3 days. But the girl early had to think about how to adapt her hands and head to some business. At first, Amber helped her grandmother, twiddling her thumbs. If you compare the family to a ship that sails on the sea called everyday life, then Mom could not be called the captain. She wouldn't rise above a diligent sailor. And when my father left, Grandma took the bridge, and Amber became her right hand. Whether it was standing at the stove, peeling apricots, ironing curtains, Amber uncomplainingly learned and did everything, though her nature asked for something else, and she was not a diligent learner. Even when her father lived at home, Amber realized happiness it is when after an early breakfast, snapped out of the house, all the paths are yours, and with the sky you can be alone. And there is so much strength inside you that you perceive as an unfortunate misunderstanding the impossibility to spread your arms and fly to be swayed by warm winds. It was from her father that she got her love of vagabonding. And he also taught his daughter that when you can, all day long you are satisfied with a piece of bread taken from home, as long as it was sprinkled with salt, when you memorize the road so that you will never get lost and come back, wherever you have wandered. When you don't pay attention to fatigue, to pains in your legs, and you can walk as long as it takes, if it's worth it. And it was worth it. Amber wasn't looking for beautiful, picture-perfect views like the others. She wasn't taking selfies. She wasn't seeking out some of the youth's favorite pastimes. At first, there was simply not enough money for that, and then the girl began to feel like a white crow among her peers and did not even try to become her own in the pack. She simply did not know and could not discuss what they knew and loved. And what touched her, frightened her, amazed or delighted her, left them completely indifferent. "I know what you want to be," Valerie, a classmate who sat at the same desk with Amber, and with whom Amber had a more trusting relationship than with the other kids, once told her. "You want to drive field trips." This happened after the teacher assigned them to write a trivial essay about the love of their homeland. Amber was choking on the topic. There was so much to tell. She was steeped in legends as much as her hair was steeped in sea air. She wanted to talk about everything, and about her favorite gorge, near which a robber had once kidnapped a girl, and she, not resigned to her fate, became a mermaid, and about the valley, where long shadows from the rocks of bizarre, sinister figures come to life in the last hour before sunset. The rocks are motionless, and the shadows fluctuate, reaching out to each other, as if talking, gesturing without words, and about the stone, which fulfills wishes, but charges a terrible price for it. It was impossible not to mention. I read it. The teacher said to her the next day, "Tell us, I want the boys to hear it too. Tell it in your own words, maybe add something else." And instead of English class that day, the class listened to Amber. Among the children were those who went abroad with their parents every summer, or even Christmas vacation. But now they were enthusiastically questioning the girl. Where is that? Have you been there yourself? And how to get there? Do wishes really come true? That's when Valerie dropped out, tucking her textbooks into her bag. "You're probably going to be a tour guide, Amber. You're a genius." When she was still in high school, she got a job at a museum complex. There were tons of them. They hired her as a curator. That meant serve, take, get out for herself, for that guy, and for the cleaning lady. And then she started leading tours. First in the low season, when it's not too crowded. Then with other, already experienced women. And now she had her own page on the internet, and on the author's excursions, which offered Amber, signed up in line. She bought a car, the loan for which she had to pay off until the second coming. And she took people to places the guides rarely went, unless they were desperate amateurs. Mostly her clients were families or young couples who were no strangers to romance. And many people asked enthusiastically at the end of the tour, "Don't you take them to the fortress?" Amber never took anyone to the fortress, although for a long time it was a very popular route. Until someone upstairs decided that it could be dangerous for tourists. Stones crumble, and sometimes whole blocks collapse from the fortress walls. Cave vaults collapse. It would be good to reconstruct, but there was no money for reconstruction, of course. And the excursions became illegal. They were offered as part of other routes in the vicinity. The guide tempted, "Let's pay a little more per nose and go to the most extraordinary place we have in our neighborhood." But Amber never took anyone to the fortress. It was her sanctuary. Jerry realized he had been cruelly played. He was barely alive, you might say, after a worsening ulcer. When he'd been seized that night, none of the household had thought it was that serious, or, one might even say, that bad. But Lisa did not want to long to look at the suffering of her husband. Jerry was lying in the fetal position, afraid to move, so as not to become more painful, and called an ambulance. Everyone thought that the matter would be limited to drips and hospitalization for a week. At the very least, surgery. But Jerry wasn't getting any better. The tests didn't seem to show anything critical. But the surgeon took him to the table, rather guided by intuition, which has and will continue to help real doctors. And in the process it was discovered that from the smart devices, it turns out, something can escape. And it was hard to take Jerry away from death. He came hard from anesthesia, and for several days even the strongest drugs did not significantly alleviate his suffering. The head nurse was particularly warm to him. She was the one who came up with the idea of letting Jerry sleep at all costs, because sleep is health. She persuaded the doctor to add sleeping pills to the prescribed medication. It probably wouldn't have had much effect on anyone else, but for Jerry it worked wonders. The pain was greatly reduced. He felt in himself that fracture, after which began, though slow, long, but still the way to recovery. And then his many friends came up with the idea to play his wife, which they could not stand too much. Lisa was in love with herself. And what's worse, after getting married, Jerry, who before that knew every dog in town, began to behave much more withdrawn. Now Lisa was deciding where they would go and whether they would go at all, who to invite to visit and in front of whom to close the door, and so on. When Lisa complained to her husband that she cannot tolerate women, so she does not get along in any team, for her coquetry, felt that they do not like me, because I am prettier than them, and because you carry me in your arms. But there were enough men on whom Lisa not only did not make any impression, she annoyed them. Usually too much manners, fixated on themselves, accustomed to being served. Lisa usually visited her husband after visiting hours were over. She and Jerry had a goodwill at the hospital, and once again Lisa was demonstrating that she was different. She didn't fill her bag with cans of hot food, she brought only fruit and water, sitting by her husband's bedside like a graceful butterfly. As she thought herself, a viper, as others thought. The prank the Powells had planned turned out to be cruel not only to Lisa, but to Jerry himself. But when they had conceived it, it had seemed so successful that the friends, as they say, had balked at the consequences. Without difficulty, they found a smashing girlfriend of one of them who agreed to play the part. They asked the same head nurse for a white coat on some pretext. One of the friends was on duty in the corridor, waiting for Lisa to arrive to give the signal. Jerry was asleep in his room. He had gotten his sleep in his sleeping pills early today, and Lisa, entering the room, caught a wild picture. The nurse was wearing almost nothing, only a conventional white robe on her shoulders. She was sitting in front of her husband, in a pose that the young woman found the most obscene of all possible, legs spread, showing off her charms. The nurse was holding a plate of omelets, scooping them into a spoon and clearly about to feed Jerry. The friends knew Lisa's character well enough to calculate how she would behave. The woman didn't squeal, didn't throw a tantrum. She simply dropped her bag and stormed out of the room. A few minutes later, one of the buddies came out, smiling. The scene gave him pleasure. Let her feel for once not like a queen, but take the place she deserves, a bitch in her own right. Lisa hadn't shown up at the hospital since. When Jerry called, she hung up, and when he was discharged, he had to move back in with his parents. He hoped temporarily. Sooner or later, he and Lisa would reconcile. She didn't even notice I was asleep, Jerry lamented. They'd chosen a pose so she couldn't see my face. Except that sister's a stripper, for crying out loud. I had no idea what the bastards were up to. I call them up, and they're laughing their asses off. You should thank us for saving you from that snake. At least we gave you a break. It'll kill you. Jason listened to Jerry's wailing and went about his business. Maybe that's why Jerry came to him. He knew he'd be listened to, but not ridiculed, judged, or bombarded with advice. Jason lived a hermit's life. If it could be said of a man who didn't live in a cave or a hut, whose apartment was on the top floor of a 5-story building, a 2-bedroom in a Khrushchevka on the edge of a big city, and then the private sector began. From the balcony you could see the river. There was a bus ring curled up near the house. There was a mini market and a few stores. Jason would come down here to get groceries, and when he decided to buy what he needed, he'd go back upstairs almost immediately. But sometimes he'd still take a walk to the river. The old houses had long ago pushed the 2- and 3-story mansions away from the embankment, and there was only one way to get to the shore, past the high fences that kept out the elite from the nobility. Jason walked without realizing he was walking like a prisoner, with his hands behind his back, standing by the water for long periods of time. Even if it was windy and damp, the Mississippi was cold just to look at. Sometimes he took a different route and went up into the mountains. It was a short walk to them, just a couple of streets, and here he was at the foot of one of them. And a paved road serpentine led to the top. It was used to take children to the camp every day. There was a mast on the mountain. There was also a radio and television station. The serpentine lengthened the way a little, but it was not worth going straight ahead. There were vipers on the slopes when it was warm, and he had to be careful not to step on one. None of Jason's friends lived like him. They considered him a crank, but agreed that perhaps his profession required it. Jason wrote books. Those who had known him for years said that he had been different before, a romantic with a wanderlust, an athlete who had achieved a lot. A man who was open-minded, even overly so. And Jason had met his Emily on one of his camping trips. Both of them were the kind of reckless people that old songs talk about. The old compass is calibrated, the maps and edges are obtained, and to storms like avalanches, the treacherous trail. Happy to whom the pinching feeling of the road is familiar, but where the wind tears horizons and blows the dawn. Jason brought the girl to his town right after that hike, straight from the Appalachians. They'd rented a room, then inherited the apartment, which Jason had never changed since. And for the few years he and Emily lived here, their house was open to everyone. There wasn't an evening when friends didn't gather, and even the neighbors would come over to listen to guitar songs and say, "You guys don't need a TV." Jason was writing his second book at the time. The first was well received, and it gave him confidence that the path is chosen correctly. You just need to go and go on it, every day marking the right number of steps. Well, that is lines. Jason went to the sea to finish the novel, and Emily, of course, went with him. It was already low season, and prices were down, so it was hoped that it would be possible to live by the sea for a few months. Money was still tight. But in late October, Jason returned home to bury Emily. The young woman's death had been a tragic accident, but even among her closest friends, no one knew anything for sure. It seemed that Emily had crashed after falling from a height, either during an excursion or during an outing with her husband in the mountains, or maybe on the rocks. It was believable. The boys were not particularly careful, and they'd had all sorts of adventurous adventures before. Emily was buried in a closed casket. Jason hadn't notified anyone about the funeral. Whoever found out by chance showed up, and it was immediately apparent that Jason had changed dramatically. He was silent, as if he had water in his mouth, hardly answering questions, ignoring condolences, and apparently wanting to be left alone. Well, grief affects everyone differently. Some people go to people to cry on someone else's shoulder, and some people don't want to expose the bleeding wound in their soul. Eventually, they got rid of Jason, gave him a chance to live the life he now wanted, and he craved privacy. From then on, he spent most of his time in the apartment, allowing himself nothing but occasional walks. But he still wrote books. True, they had changed. If before they were novels, twisted plot, where the adventures of the heroes did not give the reader an extra breath, then now Jason apparently was not capable of such a thing. Once he was fond of biathlon, took places in competitions, and now wrote stories about sports in the style of realism, with knowledge, but not so exciting anymore. Before he had a rifle for biathlon and excellent skis. When he gave up sports, he sold it all, but later he bought a gun again, an expensive hunting rifle. Now it hung over his bed at home. It was probably the most valuable thing in the house. "What do you need it for?" John asked him one day. He went to his friend's house more often than anyone else. Jason hadn't completely closed the door on his old friends, and everyone knew they could come to him and ask to stay for a few days. For example, if there was a family quarrel. And now John was practically living at his place. You don't go hunting anyway. You say you can't kill anyone. Jason looked at his friend without a smile. Maybe I'm just saying that. Or was it before? John was confused. He didn't know whether to take it as a joke or as. There was something about Jason's look that. Until now, he'd been sure that his friend was incapable of raising a hand against anyone. Now all he had to do was break the awkward pause and turn the conversation to something else. Well, that was easy. "How am I supposed to make up with Lisa?" John asked wistfully. "She not only does not want to talk to me on the phone, but also does not let me home." It was clear to everyone Lisa wants to be begged for forgiveness. But in her heart, she's also afraid that John won't have the patience. She's walking the line. In her version, John should demonstrate such a degree of remorse and beg for forgiveness in such ways that it becomes legendary among mutual acquaintances. But there's another option: John could give up and find someone else. Then Lisa, too, will have to start her life from scratch. And there's nothing worse for her. "I don't understand," Jason said. "What are you worried about? Is Lisa alive? That's the most important thing. And the rest." And he waved his hand. So John stopped talking and couldn't say anything else. Amber had a piece of jewelry in her left ear, an earring. For some reason, a single, small ruby drop. It had been threaded in her lobe for as long as Amber could remember. The earring was discreet, and Amber hardly ever thought about it, except once, when she decided at 13 to really pierce both ears and put earrings in. Girls that age have a tendency to want nothing more than earrings in their ears at a certain point in their lives. "Okay, let's go to the beautician." Mom agreed when Amber couldn't resist telling her what she wanted. "And for your birthday, I'll give you earrings gold. Of course I cannot, but silver." "I'll take this one off." Amber picked up a red droplet with her fingernail. She'd lost her pair anyway, unlike a pirate, wearing it in one ear. "No, Mom and Grandma," exclaimed at the same time. "Why? Is there something I don't know? Is this some kind of family legend? Do you cherish Sergei as a memory?" Amber looked from one woman to another, and she could feel her loved ones hesitating to tell her anything. "Just put it on and consider it a fairy tale," her grandmother added. Amber's eyes lit up. Scary tales were her favorite thing in the world. She'd read them all at the children's library, and she loved the ones with the lions, mermaids, and sorcerers more than the funny stories about girls and bunnies. When you read such things, at night you dare to go out of your room to the toilet, only if you light up the light in the whole apartment. And if some mysticism lives in their family's history, how did their loved ones hope to keep anything from her? Inga's mom was clearly the weaker link. If anyone was going to let it slip, it would be her. But Antonina only averted her eyes. "Yes," Grandma had begged. "Let's hope that everyone has already forgotten everything," said Inga's grandmother. "Does this thing bother you?" "No." "Then forget about it. And remember that you don't need to know everything." "But it's my ear." "We just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time," Mom sighed. She caught her grandmother's glance, stopped talking half a word, and as if cut off. No matter how much Inga pestered her, her mother never said a word on the subject. And only much later, having resorted to the unworthy technique of eavesdropping, Inga at least roughly understood what the matter was. Mother often came to her grandmother's house to sit up before going to bed. No matter how tired she was, but to talk, to discuss what had happened during the day, to complain about something, to ask for advice, it was more important than sleep. Sometimes my mother would sit down next to my grandmother on the edge of the sofa and whisper with her for so long that she would immediately fall asleep. And it was from the fragments of these whispers that Inga learned the story. Once in that old fortress on the mountain lived the rulers of the area. Imagine that. Where now only the wind walks through empty streets, where there are almost no houses left, not even ruins, and all the stones have been scattered. There used to be life. And thousands of people walk daily along the roads paved with stones. Water was brought up from the valley. There was a school, a market, and of course fortress walls. And the master of these places had unlimited power. His house should have been called a palace, but it was too much like a fortress. Blank walls, windows only in the courtyard. Was the largest and stood on the edge of the cliff, and inside. It was known, but no one could tell you about it in detail. There were dungeons. There was even a place where executions were carried out. It happened that those who had angered the master, or prisoners whom he hoped to exchange for a favorable exchange, were imprisoned here for 20 years. As the years passed, the fortress ceased to play its role. There was no need for people to hide behind its walls, and there were fewer and fewer and fewer inhabitants. It was a kind of a test to climb the mountains every day, to live near the sky, but to save water for everything else, to go down to the valley for every little thing. There remained old people and those who are faithful to tradition, who want to die close to their native hearth and be buried in the old cemetery next to their loved ones. There came a time when the master's family also left their home. Now the former rulers of the area lived down by the sea. Over the years, they seemed to blend in with the rest of the people, but they did not get lost. There was something among them. There was something about the old lords. All members of the clan continued to consider themselves a superior race, those to whom the land belonged, along with all the people living on it. And necessarily one of the men of the family became, as they would say in Italy, the local don, the one who unofficially but really rules, who decides the question of life and death, to whom they go to bow and who takes cruel revenge on those who hurt his interests. They came to the sea then Inge was about 5 or 6 years old, and she liked such outings very much. Though her family did not make them very often, there was always either work or not enough money. But several times during the summer they still got in the car and went to the sea for a whole day to swim, sit on the shore, enjoy the favorite places, have lunch somewhere in a cafe, wander through the stores where they sell what they do not have in their town, and come home at nightfall to both mother and grandmother. And if any mysticism lived in their family's history, loved ones hoped to keep something from her. Mom was clearly the weaker link. If anyone had let it slip, it was her. But Emily only averted her eyes. "Let's hope everyone's forgotten," Jacob's grandmother pleaded. "Is that thing bothering you?" "No." "Then forget about it. And remember, you don't need to know everything. But it's my ear." "We just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time," Mom sighed, catching her grandmother's gaze. She stopped talking halfway through the conversation, and just like that, she was cut off. No matter how much Amber pestered her, Mom never said another word on the subject. It wasn't until much later, when she resorted to the unseemly trick of eavesdropping, that Amber realized at least roughly what was going on. Mom often came to Grandma's house to sit up before bed, no matter how tired she was. Talking, discussing what had happened during the day, complaining about something, asking for advice. It was more important than sleep. Sometimes my mother would sit next to my grandmother on the edge of the sofa and whisper with her for so long that she would immediately fall asleep. And it was from the scraps of those whispers that Amber learned the story. The rulers of the area had once lived in that old fortress on the mountain. To think where now only the wind walks the empty streets, where there are almost no houses left, even the ruins, and those are scattered on the stones, before there was a boiling life. Thousands of people walked the stone-paved roads every day. Water was brought up from the valley. There was a school, a market, and of course fortress walls. And the master of these places had unlimited power. His house, which should have been called a palace, but it was too much like a fortress with blank walls and windows only to the courtyard, was the largest and stood on the very edge over the cliff. And inside it was known, but no one could tell about it in detail. There were dungeons. There was even a place where executions were carried out. It happened that those who angered the master, or prisoners, whom he hoped to exchange favorably, were imprisoned here for 20 years. Over the years, the fortress ceased to play its role. People had no need to hide behind its walls, and there were fewer and fewer inhabitants. To live near the sky, but to save on all other water, to go down to the valley for every little thing, it is a kind of a test. There remained old people, and those who were faithful to tradition, who wanted to die close to their native hearth, and be buried in the old cemetery next to their relatives. There came a time when the host's family also left their home. Now the former rulers of the area lived down by the sea. Over the years, they seemed to blend in with the rest of the people, but they did not get lost. There was something of the former rulers in the family. All of them continued to consider themselves a superior race, those to whom this land together with all the people living on it belonged. And necessarily one of the men of the family became, as they would say in Italy, the local don, the one who unofficially but truly rules, who decides matters of life and death, to whom they go to bow and who takes cruel revenge on those who hurt his interests. They came to the sea then. Amber was about 5 or 6 years old, and she loved such outings, though the household did not make them very often. There was always work or not enough money. But a few times during the summer they still got in the car and went to the sea for the day, to swim, sit on the shore, enjoy their favorite places, eat lunch in a cafe, wander through the stores that sell things they don't have in their town, and with darkness falling, return home to their mother and grandmother. That day couldn't help but stick in the memory. Amber was wearing a light blue plaid sundress. She was already badly tanned, her blonde hair tangled by the wind. The beach was less crowded than usual. The wind, carrying sand in the face, scared away the vacationers, and the waves on the sea had risen. But Amber ran along the edge of the shore, once on the ankle ran into the water, then retreated so that the wave did not cover her head, then snatched out of the water some particularly brightly colored pebble. Even her mother, who was far from any creativity, was admiring her daughter at this moment. If there was an artist or photographer here now, he would definitely admire how good Amber was. The girl didn't know that another couple was watching her father and son, who were in a tent nearby. Not everyone could afford to rent a beach house, so most of the tents were empty. But on this windy day, the father and son were more comfortable with the brightly colored fabric protecting them from the flying sand. Look, said a boy of about 12, pointing to Amber. There was something haughty in his oriental appearance and mannerisms. Her father looked at the girl and raised his eyebrows questioningly. So, well, you choose who you like, the boy explained. And don't tell me that's not true. I'm not a little kid anymore, I know. Who told you what? Father asked nonchalantly. Yes, I know about the girl who jumped out of the window and crashed, too. Father stretched, put his hands behind his head and said, looking at the sea. Well, you see, our wishes don't always end well. But that's for you. It's different for me, the boy objected. The father grinned. Son Emir was the only person who could speak to him like that. No, he hadn't been brought up in the Oriental way, where a child is allowed to do anything until a certain age. Emir knew his turns, knew how to behave properly if he had to. And yet he had no fear of his father, and deep down he was sure that he would go much further than him. Every now and then it would come out. Did you like her that much? I don't think she was pretty, Emir asked. How much do you understand? There was no embarrassment in his father's voice. He was just uncomfortable with the story. Well, you chose that one, and I choose this one. I like her. What are you going to do with her? Nothing for now. Let her live. When she's old enough, I'll take her back to our place. You're like a Turk. They used to kidnap their brides. My father's tone was mocking, but there was genuine warmth in it. I think it was more slaves, the boy said, surprised. Amber had been running up and down the beach, and now she wanted to swim. She was already pretty good in the water, but since her father wasn't with them, her grandmother made her wear a child's inflatable vest that fastened in the front with a drawstring. Amber ran to beg for permission to swim and was animatedly telling her grandmother something, gesticulating. Paul, his father, called to the gray-haired man who always accompanied them. He immediately bent down to his master. Do you know who they are? From their appearance, it seems that if they have come, they have not come from far away. Yes, Herman Yefimovich. You know, we'd like to secure the girl for the future, so to speak. Pavel didn't point directly at Amber, but made a certain movement with his eyes. I see your point. Emir smirked. He realized that he had allowed himself more than usual, had behaved even brazenly, and was quite sure that his father would refuse him. But he had chosen a good day, and his father was in a good mood. And in general, it doesn't hurt to check the boundaries of permissible from time to time. Grandma and Mom were shocked when Paul and the makeup girls from the beauty parlor showed up at their house in the evening, chewing gum in her mouth. One of them pierced Amber's ear and stuck an earring in it. The maiden, however, was apparently not evil. She chatted with the girl and said that they bring 2-year-olds to her, and in general there is nothing to talk about. 1, 2 and done. That earring is very pretty. It's a stone. Ruby, the stone of love. And it has a tiny little seal on it that you can see if you look closely. The family tried to be indignant at first, to say that it was out of the question, but Paul repeated twice something that frightened everyone, and hinted that misunderstandings with this man could end badly. After all, taking Amber away now is the easy part, and there's little the police can do to help to everyone. The girl will just go missing. It happens, and trying to hide or take her away isn't an option either. If you get the urge, they'll get you from under the ground. Don't cry. Humanly speaking, I understand. I'll tell you what, no one will touch you now. Live as you have lived, raise your little girl. So much that all this will be forgotten quickly, and no one will ever remember you or that earring. But for some reason they put it on try not to cry. Mom, who was scared out of her wits, wiped away her tears with the palm of her hand. Paul shrugged. Well, what can you do when you're talking about a child? A ring or a bracelet? The baby is growing, the jewelry will quickly become tight. She'll lose the tip. An earring is a reliable thing. Did the slave owners think so too? Grandma put it in. Her voice was creaky for some reason. Stepfather Paul looked at her carefully. Well, you got it right. Once again I say, I'm almost certain that everything will be fine. With that he bowed out. That's the phrase the relatives clung to. If you sit quietly, do not try to fight, argue. If you do not get on the road, and look, it will pass. And it was hard to imagine a quieter life than the family led in the following years. Their town is small, less than 30,000 people live here, and it's 24 kilometers from the sea, so even in the summer there is no such pandemonium as on the coast. Mostly those who are interested in history come here. After all, on the maps of this place appeared in the 16th century. And there are plenty of real antiquities here. Caves along the lawn, in the mountains and rocks, where the first settlers huddled so densely that in some places the slopes of the mountains resemble honeycombs. But if you don't go where the tourists take you, the town is quiet and sleepy. Narrow streets, blank stone fences. That's the fence Amber grew up behind. And then when she reached out to people herself, when she started working at the museum, the terrible incident was somehow forgotten and erased from her memory. It's been too many years. It's definitely forgotten now. Amber and her red mark. Her mother secretly followed the fate of the owner, knew that he lived abroad for several years. And when his father came back, his son was still out there somewhere. Yes, he studied in Europe. Mother knew that the master's distant ancestors had once owned a fortress, and now he had built himself a house, before which the old fortress was only a pale reflection, a real castle on the seashore. And grandmother used to say that he sits there, God forgive him, like a spider to which the threads of everything dark, gloomy, illegal in their land are drawn. And the guy eventually came back. Why? Why wasn't he in Europe? His father had decided to gradually bring him up to speed, to hand over the reins of power. I just hoped Amber never met him. Amber would take the guests in her old car. Usually the less discerning ones would agree, and she'd drive them around the sights. Or her clients did not agree to drive anything but their own foreign cars. And then in the agreed place sat in their car, and then already took on the role of a guide. Today's job was a little more unusual than before. She had to pick up these guys right at the station. They'd arrived in a matter of days. Sports competitions, a tight schedule, and they wished for such a program. They'd get off the train and go on a tour. And then it's back to the hotel. What's Amber's main concern? That the group was small. As always, she never took more than 4 or 5 people, usually less. And the money had already been transferred to her card. So she stood on the platform and watched the cars slowly pass by. She recognized her clients at once, 3 young guys. One look at them and immediately diagnosed them as basketball players, and an older man with them. Even his whiskers are graying. The guys must have been inspired by the fact that their guide was such a young girl. But Amber, with a restrained smile, responded to the jokes at the attempted flirting, and then she got everyone in the car so that the oldest in the group was next to her in the front seat. The part of the road ahead was boring, through the steppe. Sometimes cab drivers asked passengers to talk to me, or I'm afraid I'll doze off at the wheel. But Amber was in no danger of that. After all, there were the steppe yaks and their battles, their chiefs, their mounds. Even here she managed to tell fascinating stories, poured the bird, and listened that tourists almost sighed with regret when the sea showed in the distance. After all, that meant the end of the story. She spoke to herself, looking in the mirror at the man sitting next to her. He reminded her of an elephant. Maybe it's called a Roman profile. But it seemed to Amber that his forehead went so smoothly, without curves, into his nose that it looked like a short elephant trunk. Amber thought back to last winter. She'd gotten lucky with an order then. She'd patronized a group flying in from St. Petersburg like chickens, and they hadn't wanted to let her go. They asked her to celebrate New Year's Eve with them at one of the most luxurious recreation centers. This, in addition to the fee for excursions. Those days were strange. Here, in their climate, where it rarely snows, it happens that you cannot wait for the whole winter. But then the New Year's week was snowy, and tourists did not know what kind of entertainment to think up. They skated on the artificial ice, and the bathhouse, that's for sure, and the equestrian club, and some even ordered a helicopter. And of course the New Year's celebration itself, when in a cafe stylized as a Russian terem, set the tables and until morning was to continue the fun and dancing. And Amber then ran away. She served her part with the band all evening in the arena and escaped to the cottage where they had put her up. One of the guests went after her. It was a dark-haired, pleasant, middle-aged man. He brought champagne and brought no hindsight. It was just that he was an introvert and didn't want to spend the rest of the night in a crowd. Better to sit in the living room with this nice girl, look at the fire in the fireplace and through the panoramic windows at the snow-covered, garland-lit forest, drink champagne and talk. Igor was married and regretted that it turned out so that his Olga could not come. Suddenly swamped with things at work, and the vouchers were already bought, and Olga kicked him out to rest for 2. And that's when Igor told Amber, "I think that every person is like some animal. And you? I'm like a dog, I guess." From Amber's point of view, he looked like a raccoon, short in stature, graceful, with deep-set and dark eyes. But Amber had remained silent out of politeness. But now she remembered him, because elephant was a very subtle definition. This time she drove the guests around almost until the evening. She showed them the main resort town. The local nice went aboard a sailing ship with them. It used to be filmed a lot in movies, but now it was a bar. They stood on the observation decks, drank water from the spring, drowned in legends, and bought as a souvenir burlap bags with fragrant herbs. The final point was a restaurant where they served fish that was still swimming in the sea in the morning. She was treated to local wines. Then Amber had to take her guests to the doorstep of the hotel. She didn't drink much wine, but the guys got pretty drunk. They felt like they were friends forever. And they asked Emily to come cheer them on at the competition tomorrow. "Can I ask you a favor?" the older man asked. Amber recognized him. His name was Jason, and he wasn't a coach or some kind of chaperone, just a friend of one of the boys' fathers, and he'd come along for the ride. She raised her eyebrows at him now, smiling welcomingly, but she really didn't like these unexpected requests. There was no telling what would pop into her head. "Amber, don't you take me to the fortress?" Kyle interrupted, and after the third drink he decided to switch to you with her. "No, I can't go to the fortress." "Why not?" Kyle's voice trailed off. You had to listen to him to make out the words. "Grandmother won't let me go." Kyle looked at her in amazement. "It's dangerous. Caves crumbling. Underground mazes. She won't let me in." "Well, what do you want?" Amber explained. Like her, Jason hadn't had much to drink that night. "There's a Gregory Evans living here. He's the landlord." Jason began slowly, "and they say he's built himself a castle that would make an English queen jealous. I'd like to take a closer look at it. I understand about private property and all that. But will you take me to a place where I can get a good view of the castle? I know it's over the top, but I'll pay." Amber stopped the car where few people would. Only someone who knows every rock, every ledge in the area. The road was narrow, a steep slope to the left, the sea below. Here, a dense forest. But at the sight of it, Amber remembered the marshes. The green and lush crowns gave the deceptive impression of a carpet. It looked like moss from afar, but you couldn't step on it, you'd fall through. To the right rose steep cliffs. Such cliffs can be climbed only with mountaineering equipment. No stranger would park here. But Amber found a small ledge. She parked her car so it wouldn't get in the way of anyone driving by. It wasn't a busy road, though it led to nowhere, to a small village with no sights, nothing of interest to tourists. Here Jason started. I'll show you the path. Amber led him to a little noticeable path that went steeply downward, but still allowed him to get down to the sea. Divers used to love this place, Amber explained. They used to have a different road so you could drive a car to the water. These guys always have their gear with them. You know, tents, stuff like that. It's a lot of cargo. And then when they built the castle, they blocked the road. There was even a court case in the end. You know, between the people have a right and private property won. Some people tried to give a damn. Mostly not the people who live here, but the people who come here every year to snorkel. The water here is clear, and it feels like you're not swimming, but floating in the blue sky like an angel. While someone tried to ride like they used to. True, they chose a time when it was usually quiet early morning, late evening. They hoped no one would notice them. But people invariably stood on the road, guards, you wouldn't believe it, with real weapons, automatic rifles or something like that. All kinds of camouflage on their chests. So we realized it was serious, so we stopped trying. There's still this trail, it's off to the side. It was laid by the most stubborn. There's a forest almost all the way to the sea. You can go down and snorkel. It's a little awkward to climb back, but you can see the castle from there. Jason stared at her for a few seconds. Amber couldn't tell at once what she saw in that look of gratitude, but it was clearly something else. Thank you, Amber. Anything further, he held out the money to her. But the girl only took one of the bills out of his hand. She was always honest about her work and didn't take tips. How will you get out of here? Hitchhike. There's a hitchhiker every half hour or an hour or less, Jason shrugged. It was a small thing to him. Let me wait for you. My mom says the owner's so reclusive because the 90s aren't over for him. No, girl, Jason said softly. It all started earlier, much earlier, and thank you for the offer. But I'd like to be alone, and thank you also for the fact that without you, I wouldn't have found this path. He nodded his goodbye and started down the path, recognizing it for what it was. In some places, he had to hold on to tree roots to keep his balance. Sometimes the path was blocked by ravines, into which one had to descend and then climb down their slippery clay slopes. Really, you had to love diving to come here. Besides, whatever Jason was up to, it wouldn't be worth the delay. It was getting dark soon, and darkness in the south fell quickly, almost in an instant. It must have been about 20 minutes when the shore came into view. The forest had receded, and he saw a narrow strip of large pebbles. He also saw the castle. It rose up on his right hand and seemed to rise out of the sea, though it was built on a low cliff. It was built of stone of gray, but of such a dark shade that now in the evening light the castle seemed black. Some historian, architect, or art critic would have been tempted to argue that the castle was built in accordance with the traditions of the people who had lived here for centuries. It had nothing in common with Gothic and with those castles and palaces that could not protect their owners from enemies but were works of art in themselves. No, the man who built such a thing thought first of all of his own safety. Blank walls, windows as narrow as loopholes, gates as tall as 3 men. How much evil had to be done to be so afraid of retribution? And Jason remembered the morning Emily had disappeared. He sat at his computer early. He worked best in the morning hours. His head wasn't so clear after that. Emily brought him coffee, came up behind him. All he saw was her hand with the inexpensive metal bracelet. She was placing a steaming cup in front of him. Then he felt the touch of her lips on his hair. Emily kissed him lightly. I'm off to the market. Can you believe it's all over? Not even breakfast, she said. Engrossed in his work, he didn't realize until 10 o'clock when he felt hungry. Emily hadn't returned by then. It was unbearably sickening to think of what had followed. Desperate searching and terror in his soul from the first minute. Somehow he had been certain from the beginning that something very bad, terribly bad, had happened that could not be undone. Emily couldn't get lost, couldn't hang out with her friends. She didn't have any friends here either. Go to a movie or go swimming. Trouble happened. Emily was found about 2 weeks later on a beach just like this, by the water. And there was no way of knowing how she could have gotten there. She was lying on the rocks, a broken doll in tattered clothes. And it was only her face that her death had made completely calm. The police, who up to that point had been honestly searching for the young woman, suddenly led further investigation, as if they were certain of the only theory. And it was hardly Jason's fault. "You must have had a fight," the investigator insinuated. "So she left. She'd taken her own life, as they say." Jason stared at her with shocked eyes. He couldn't even speak. He was at a loss for words. Emily was the most precious thing in his life. What would he be without her? Quite possibly just carelessness. The investigator retreated a little. The grounds here were beautiful. She wanted to get a closer look. The rocks under her feet crumbled, and she took off. "Are you saying that right from the market with a heavy bag without saying anything to anyone?" Emily went far away to admire the views. "And that's not bullshit to you?" The investigator shrugged. "Well, it's not like a woman can think of anything." It wasn't until later, asking everyone himself, that Jason found a young merchant who told him. "I saw Emily being pushed into the car. It happens to us," the trader said, averting his eyes. "Usually these women come back after a while. You were just unlucky." From the same man, Jason had learned about the all-powerful owner of this place. It's no use going to the police with this. He's not only got it in his pocket, they're scared shitless of him. And as you know, I wouldn't be a witness. Life, is more precious. You're already attracting a lot of attention. You'll come home one day and his men will tell you to leave immediately, or they'll find you. Just like that, on the beach. Or maybe they won't find you at all. Wrap it up. You can't fight a crowbar, as they say. And Jason somehow knew Emily hadn't been killed. I mean, not literally killed. She'd gotten a minute and either tried to escape but failed or just threw herself from a height. She had never been afraid of heights in the mountains. One had to watch out for others all the time, keep an eye on her. And heights had done her one last favor. It had saved her from something Emily couldn't bear. Jason had taken her advice, but not because he'd decided to accept it, to forgive it, to forget it. It was just that the master's power here was absolute now. An armor in which no vulnerability could be found. But if you wait, if you put your whole life into waiting for your hour, your minute, your one and only minute, that chance would come sooner or later. Amber was waiting for him by the car. She was squatting on her haunches, picking through small stones, looking for clear quartz shards. It was a habit of hers. "Let's go," she said, getting up and shaking her palms off her shorts. "I knew you'd come out of the dark. I waited." He was genuinely surprised. "How could I leave you?" And yet the light was almost out. And the first thing Amber did when she got behind the wheel was turn on the headlights. "Mom, let's get out of here. I'm scared for some reason." Amber didn't expect those words to come out of her mouth. She'd known about her master her whole life, as long as she could remember. And she'd been to these places near his castle many times. But today this stranger, so strange, so a little like an elephant, by his mere presence stirred her. Now she had a premonition of bad things to come. Like an animal senses an earthquake coming. Her mother had just fed Amber some fried potatoes, poured her some tea, and returned to her knitting. "Where are we going?" she asked. There was a certain irritation in her voice. She knew Amber must have known that they were trapped and had nowhere to go. There wasn't a penny to spare in the family and no relatives or acquaintances willing to take them in. And how do you leave home? It's the only thing they got. Mom lived here for years without ever leaving. She was afraid of everything. She had never been abroad. She was afraid of foreign passports, a foreign language, incomprehensible money, which was incomprehensible how much it would be in rubles. At the first store you would be left without a penny. And my mother was afraid of her country, 2 trains with drunken shift workers, airplanes that crashed, pimps at train stations, swindlers and thieves. "If I go to my dad's?" Amber asked. "There's almost a direct train there, with only one change at the very end." "Don't even think about it." Mom jumped up. "He really needs you. He's already got a son and a daughter. Let him take care of them." "I'm not saying move in with him," Amber corrected her mom gently. "Just in the same town as him. Maybe he'll give me a job and then I'll get an apartment. I'm an adult, Mom, and you're wrong to say he doesn't want me. He's been sending me money for my birthday all these years, you know it. It's in your book." Grandma looked at Mom with an expression that clearly said, "See, I was right," and Mom was embarrassed. But she quickly found a clue. No, I'm not letting you on a train across the country." "I had an acquaintance," Grandma said melancholically. "She was older than me, As a child, she survived in the trenches of Stalingrad. Then she graduated from a fishery technical school and was sent to Sakhalin. She was small in stature, with a point, black eyes, and a big bow in her braid. She traveled with geologists to Vladivostok on a train across the country on the third shelf somewhere, because there were not enough seats. Then by boat to the island, and worked there as a foreman at the combine. Her mother's eyes darted, fingers begging her to stop this conversation, not to lead Amber astray. Amber went to the fortress. It was a kind of place of power for her. The ruins had been closed off from tourists for a while permanently. The risk of accidents had become too great, and the caves and underground passages had to be reinforced to prevent an unexpected collapse. But there was no place in their neighborhood where Amber didn't know the secret paths. Leaving the car at the foot of the hill, she began to climb up the mountain. And the town died out. Here and there remnants of towers, crooked streets half erased by time, a cemetery. Caves, roofed in the rocks, long ago deserted dwellings, debris, stones, dust, and ashes, where the eye finds no joy. 2 or 3 families, like shadows, wander among the bare walls, but barracks for them are native hearths and the temple of their fathers. A black car, over which smooth circles, soaring, draws an eagle on the mountain heights. These lines, written long ago, really came to life here, in these ancient walls, although now it was no longer possible to meet even 2 or 3 families here. Amber had spent the night here once. Of course, withheld from her loved ones, not on a bet, and not with a young man. It was just that since childhood she had felt her belonging to this ancient fortress, her kinship with those who lived here. It was well known about her host's ancestors that they owned the very house of which only ruins remained. But Amber knew from somewhere that her great-grandparents had come from this area. Maybe one of them had been a potter or a small merchant who went down to town every day, set up shop. Or maybe there isn't even dust left of their house now. But their souls, they were still here. These people, generation after generation, had survived here, where every drop of water was precious, and where even grass grew so sparsely on the sun-hot rocks. Survived, fought off enemies, and stayed here after the master's family left. Which meant this place was theirs by right, not stolen from them by legal violence. Amber told her friend at home that she'd stay the night, but she went up to the fortress in the late afternoon and found a spot near the crossroads. There were bushes of dried wormwood poking through the paving stones. There was still a stone arch over one of the roads. Nearby were 2 nations' ancient temples. One simpler, smaller, trimmed in wood, the other larger, with heavy columns, with doors that in Amber's memory were perpetually locked, though she peered through the windows, trying to see what was inside. The sunset made the fortress an absolutely fantastic sight, and it was particularly vivid itself. It seemed that Amber had never seen such vivid colors of the sky, rich purples, golds, and purples. It was the hour when that which was unimaginable and fabulous in the daytime awakens all the otherworldly power whose breath is in the air in a way that cannot be put into words. Amber sat here until dawn. At times she was sure she could make out faint light shadows, swift or slow, but she felt no fear. She waited for someone to speak to her, or to give her some sign. Above her head were large stars, like grains of shining salt. Every now and then a long streak of a meteorite could be seen. Amber remembered her childhood. She'd been given a little Umka telescope, and it had been a real shock for her to see for herself, with her own eyes, that the moon was not a golden disk, so natural in the night sky and in pictures that it was almost unnoticeable. No, the moon is a stone ball, riddled with lunar craters. And it hangs in the black void of space. It's one thing to read about it, but it's another to see it. It took her a long time to catch a glimpse of meteors, even though her grandmother had told her, "There's a bright one coming." When Amber finally saw the flying stars, she remembered her father's hands as he struck a match to light a cigarette. And she thought maybe God was doing it up there in the sky. Then her legs got stiff, and she stood up, thinking that every step she took would make a thudding sound on the paving stones beneath her feet. But she walked quite silently, like a spirit, reached the temple and stroked one of the columns. It was a movement of which she was not aware to herself. And then she walked down the alley under the archway, and inhaling the bitter odor of wormwood, thought that this was what the stars smelled like. She did not go down into the dungeon, though she had been there before. But she had not brought a flashlight, and without it she was afraid of tripping on the steps, stumbling, falling somewhere. So she walked outside the fortress walls and went to the tomb, the obelisk above which was particularly high on the mountainside. Amber knew that a very young girl was buried here. She had died while even younger than Amber was now. A girl from a wealthy family had carried water to the fortress during the siege. Skinny as she was, she managed to slip between the bars of the fence. She made the journey again and again with the heavy burden, and her heart failed her. The bird girl. Then Amber met the dawn next to the grave, but there was still no fear. On the contrary, the feeling that she was not alone was growing in her. Of course, Amber never said a word at home about her nighttime escapade. Mom would have been heartbroken, and Grandma would have freaked out in hindsight. But many times after that, Amber had come here in times of need to regain her inner strength and composure. And now she sat in complete silence for a long time on the grass at the edge of the road. Only the wind ruffled her hair and occasionally sang in the narrow streets like the distant sound of strings. Today she was driving a new group of husband, wife, and 2 children. The family didn't want to buy shared excursions. With children, you can never guess what if they get carsick, have to stop the car, and what if they get thirsty or have to go back. And the program the mother and father asked to adjust to the children. The girl was 8 and the boy was 5. Not tiring, not hot, interesting, and a place to get drunk and eat. Amber took them to the Museum of Fairy Tales and walked with her guests along the paths of the park for a long time, talking about fairy tale characters as well as an experienced guide. She worried while the children wondered and marveled to their heart's content to have their pictures taken. Then they had a snack at the cafe and had to finish the day at the observation deck. We had to give the adults a chance to admire the beauty of the area too. For Amber, the main charm was the sea always alive with its brightest holiday colors, blue, 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 green, and the vegetation still below. Drowning in the greenery of the southern city was very nice. It was a weekday, and this observation deck was not one of the most famous. So when they'd come here, Amber had figured and had no doubt already that they'd be alone on the platform. But at the very last moment they were cut off by a car, a white Cherokee Jeep. It cut them off so unexpectedly and brazenly that it could have been bad. Amber almost drove off the road, and that would have been a disaster. Serpentine roads everywhere, steep slopes everywhere. She felt an icy dread. Not so much for herself, but for the strangers in the car. Damn it. She almost never argued with other drivers, never got into arguments. And though almost always, if something happened on the road, it wasn't her fault, Amber swallowed the chicken that you can't let those women drive and the brainless blonde just as long as they'd leave her alone. But now, when she saw that the Jeep had stopped near the same lot where they were headed, Amber couldn't help herself. She slammed the door and strode toward the black car, taking the distance between them in 4 strides. "Are you crazy?" She lashed out at the guy who stepped on the ground. "Do you realize you almost got us all killed?" And she faltered. Because this Ambo looked at her without the slightest sense of guilt, with such a slight smirk, as if not a person, but a bug he got on the road, which he was about to crush with his foot. And then she recognized him. His portrait was not published in the newspapers, but she often found references to him and his photographs on the internet. Too often the owner's son was involved in all sorts of stories. And usually in a car he'd race with his friends at breakneck speed through the city at night and hit someone, or he'd get into a fight he'd provoked, or there'd be an absolutely scandalous orgy party, for no one had the courage to call it anything else. Resentment struggled with fear in Amber. Especially as it turned out, Emir wasn't traveling alone in the car. He never rode alone, and 2 of his friends of the same age and perhaps even stronger build were now standing beside him, grinning just as unkindly. Amber remembered the earring. She wanted to see if it covered her hair, but didn't dare. She could only hope that the curly blonde strands hid her earlobes, but it was a futile hope. "I remember you," Emir said, ignoring Amber's anger, ignoring her mood. "Were you the one slapping bare heels on the beach back then? You couldn't forget me either. You're still wearing my sign." He looked at her like a landlord coming home to check on his possessions. "You were such a little girl then. I thought you'd never grow up to be anything good. But you turned out to be pretty good." The tourists started getting out of the car. Amber should have gone with them, but she stood stiffly as the owner's son walked around her, looking at her from every angle. Looking at her from every angle. "Where do you live? What do you care? What do you really care? Because you're coming with us now." "I'm not." "Who's going to ask you?" The smirk got even wider. Amber knew it was useless to yell. There was no one around to stand up for her but the father of the family. Still, as she was dragged to the car, she cast desperate glances at the family. Unless these people were afraid, if they could tell. You didn't see anything one of the customers approached them, after the Jeep door had already slammed shut and swallowed Amber. Is that clear? But how are we going to get out of here? We don't even know where we are. The man didn't dare say anything, the woman decided. And his voice wasn't shaking. Shuttle you'll catch. With these words, the guy got into the car and the Jeep sped off so sharply that it almost drove over the tourists' legs. They barely had time to bounce, and a few more minutes coughing because such a dust rose. The adults were so impressed by the experience that they could not immediately begin to talk, although the children, and break them, trying to understand what was happening. It was late in the evening when Amber's mother came to the hotel where the family was staying. She was distraught and found her daughter's notebook, where Amber had written down the schedule of her excursions and the phone numbers of her clients. Only she, this crying woman, not the police, had dared to tell the husband and wife what had happened on the observation deck. But they didn't remember the license plate number, saying they were in shock. They didn't care. And they stood firm on that. They couldn't give us a good description of the guy. A big guy in a black t-shirt with some friends with him. And then they watched through the window as the small figure of a woman, covering her face with her hands, went away. Into the night. "Just don't throw me into a thorn bush," the phrase popped into Amber's head. And it somehow became the only thing she could cling to like a lifeline. They'd been driving for about 10 minutes now. Amber was sandwiched in the back seat between two thugs. She tried to ignore their dirty jokes. She was the only one who needed to scratch out a ghostly chance at salvation. "Are you taking me to the castle?" Amber asked briefly, still ignoring Emir's friends. "Why? Have you wanted to go there for a long time?" "Really? Not only a tour guide, but also a call girl. I haven't seen all the clients' houses yet." "You haven't." "That's true. You guys don't let anyone in. You're like spiders in a web. But there's always a way out." "And what is your way out?" "I assure you, the gate is like a door to a safe. A flea can't get through. You won't escape, will you?" "There is a way out. I've already escaped through your father's window. I'm not afraid of death. Don't think about chewing through the bars with your teeth." He nodded at her wrist. Something had changed. Almost imperceptibly, but Amber felt it. "Aren't you afraid of anything?" Emir asked. The iron confidence and mockery were gone from his voice. "Why, nothing." Amber spoke in a deliberately harsh tone that she had never spoken before in her life. "I'm afraid of the fortress. They say there are ghosts there in droves. They step on each other's toes. I had a friend stay there for a night on a dare and she nearly went mad. I'm not afraid of that lock thing you've got going on." "Yep, that's a good idea." One of the guys came to life. "It's under reconstruction. None of the people are there. Let's stick her in one of those holes. She'll sit there for a day or two and then we'll take her back. It'll be silk. It's better than if that rabid thing starts gnawing on her own veins. Or your throat." Emir thought for a minute, and then became lively. "Come on, let's do it." He had a premonition of unusual entertainment. There was almost nothing left unavailable to him in this world. He was already satiated. But to shake the family history, for his ancestors had put their enemies, or perhaps captives, in those dreadful caves. It was tempting to do as they did. This fool won't run away. Even if there is a small window in such a cave, it is very narrow. You can't fit through it. And if you turn around, you'll find yourself under a cliff. Then all you can do is throw yourself down, just to be sure. And if that crazy woman throws herself down, no one will ever think anything of Emir. It's not the same old story with Dad. The owner could do almost anything, but it took a lot of money to cover up that old story. And here's a careless girl climbing a mountain and getting killed. It's her own fault. But Emir had no doubt the girl would never get out of those underground passages. Jason bought a hunting rifle, according to all the rules, having collected the documents and having a hunting ticket. But it was not worth looking for it afterward in the company of those who wanted to shoot a bird or kill a boar. Afterward, he laundered the trophies. Sharing tales, Jason retreated into the woods. Loneliness had long been his shadow, his second self, and he'd come back without any booty. He had another goal in mind, to preserve his sniper skills and that inner focus that would so easily be lost in the shooting range. Jason needed that inner determination and willingness to pass the point of no return as much as he needed a steady and accurate hand. He would go far away where no other hunters could get to him, and where no one could hear the sound of the shot. Jason would only shoot at a target until he felt he was ready for anything that might come out of his scheme. All these years he'd spent money on himself more than sparingly, royalties set aside. And by the time it was decided it was time, he had enough saved up to buy a black market sniper rifle. If Amber's mother kept an eye on her master's life, not for any particular purpose, more out of caution, she sighed in relief when she heard he was leaving the country. Jason, on the other hand, knew exactly what he was waiting for. Even the strongest enemy has a moment of weakness, a moment when he opens up. He had to wait patiently for that moment, not to miss it. When Amber led him to the closest place to the castle, Jason realized once again that it was useless to look for luck here. The castle was too far away from people and too well protected. It wasn't worth trying to get to someone hidden behind its walls. There were other options to consider: access roads, places in the city where the owner occasionally visited. Jason knew he would wait patiently, that he would lay his life on it and wait. After all, what would happen to himself afterward was of no concern to him. He didn't think about the consequences, and frankly didn't care about them. But he realized how carefully he had to think over every step, so that his life's work would not remain unfinished. At the hotel, he took a room on the second floor with a low-hanging balcony. It wasn't always easy for an outsider to get onto the front of the building, but it wouldn't be a problem for him to get out of here himself if the need arose. Jason didn't know how long he'd be here, so he paid for 2 weeks for now. He'd see how long it would take. He went to the market where Emily had gone on her last day. He needed to get in tune with her. From a common sense point of view, it was inexplicable. But the chance we get often defies all logic. Over the years, the market has become almost unrecognizable. New pavilions and signs have appeared. But this place was revived as early as it is now. Although most of the resort visitors were still asleep, traders were already laying out their goods on the stalls. There had once been merchants in the ancient fortress too, and they had come down every day to set up their shops. Jason remembered that there had been competition then, and he'd been quietly discouraged from taking cucumbers from Peter or apricots from Ahmed. He waters his garden with cesspool waste. Fertilizer, you'll want, he was told. But how could one pass by golden curd, velvety pure apricots, purple grapes, or cucumbers just plucked from the bed? It was impossible to think of anything else but the blissful satisfaction of hunger. Now the early customer was welcome, and the first saleswoman grabbed Jason with her chatter in her hands, which were already placing the clear yellow plums on the scales. But as he counted out the money, Jason froze, listening to the conversation of the women next door with their wares. That's how that girl got stolen and taken away in broad daylight. The mother's ready to go to the noose. Yeah, I know that family. The last thing I thought was that they'd be the ones to get into this kind of trouble. Always so quiet, always the first to say hello when they meet. That girl Amber is either 18 or 19 years old. And why her? Well, she's pretty, I'll give her that. How did you find out? The mother, it turns out, kept it a secret from everyone that her girl had a crush on this boy years ago. Now Amber hasn't come home, and the mother's looking for her, because the police are notoriously unreliable. People who saw it all happen, who saw her being dragged into the car, have come forward. But well, if there are witnesses, will the police let it go this time too? So what witnesses? They all got scared, quickly packed up and left. And now they'll have to find them. And the mothers will say it's all a fabrication, said the full-figured shopkeeper, shifting the apricots so carelessly that the soft sides of the apricots were pitted by her fingers. By God, I think I'm going mad. This is medieval. The master is the Lord. It's always been like that in my lifetime. And it will go on. My son has grown up there, said another. And what is your mother not afraid to tell now? Isn't it too late for her to realize it? What has she got to lose? The only hope now is that everybody will know about it. Maybe then that scum will be ashamed to go all the way. He'll let her go in the end. After he's played with her, he'll let her go. When did this happen? Jason asked, forgetting about the change the peddler was counting out for him. I found out yesterday, the full-figured woman said. That's the kind of thing we get. You come here like you're in paradise for a vacation, but not everything is so peaceful and quiet. Who can give me the address of this family? Jason asked. Please. Do you want to help one guest? Well, help. They've always lived poor, and Mom's sure going to need the money now. I don't know whether she's at home or in the hospital. How much medicine costs? Can you imagine? Tell me the address, I'll remember it. It wasn't 20 minutes before Jason knocked on the gate of the house on the quiet street. The gate was 3 boards, the brown paint peeling off long ago. There was no bell, but even a delicate knock was enough for the unlocked gate to open by itself. Jason followed the path through the garden to the house. 2 women were sitting on the open veranda. One, very old, slouched in a chair with armrests and red eyes. The other, younger, stood toward him, clamping her hands over her mouth, apparently in no doubt what news he had brought. And Jason's heart ached in a way it hadn't in years. It was as if he'd been transported back to the hour he'd learned of Emily's death. Jason raised his palms in a soothing gesture. I didn't bring bad news. I want to learn something and maybe help. But you're not the police, said the younger one, the mother. And there was more affirmation in it than questioning intonation. Jason realized she was already there. Already tried to raise everyone's ears. It didn't work. She'd been told something like, wait, a young girl's been out for 3 days, ran away, decided not to let you know. Now mother and grandmother were hitting this uncertainty like birds against glass. Their hearts were about to fail. I'm not the police, he said, and he could hear the change in his voice. I understand that you know who your Amber is in whose hands, and that this man has had his eye on her for a long time. That is correct. And a picture of your daughter I'd like to see, if I may. The mother shrugged her shoulders shakily. The shawl thrown over them, apparently grabbed from the bed, didn't help. She went quickly into the room and soon returned with a red-bound album, an old album, the kind they used to glue pictures of children from birth many years ago. Her mother opened the album to the last page, stroked the picture of a pretty blonde-haired girl with big, clear eyes. There was nothing of the modern girl in her. She looked like an easy victim who had fallen into the golden hands of Cochet, who would take her wherever he wanted. I'll hire a hitman, mother said. Sell everything we have, this house, everything. And we'll hire someone to kill that rotter at last. Tanya, Grandma raised her voice. The thing to think about right now was how to help Amber. No such thoughts just yet. Mother dropped her head on the table and cried with her grief. That's right, it had all come to pass. It was as if she were standing over Amber's coffin. It was impossible to question her now, and Jason got the story from his grandmother. She, too, had changed in the last 24 hours. If Jason had known her before, he would have seen how she had aged. Now she was an old woman sitting in front of him, immersed in herself, a little crazy. But he didn't know what to say to both of them, because now all he had to do was risk everything, and no one knew what the consequences of his move would be. What can you do for her? Again, it was not the mother who asked, but the grandmother. The mother was still unable to speak coherently. I'll try to find out where she is. And then it will depend on the circumstances. One more question, please. I know this is difficult for you, but I need to know. You know Amber best. If she escaped, where would she go? Would she go back home, or would she try to hide somewhere? Would she run to the police, or would she go far away without saying a word to anyone? Mother raised her head. At these words, she and grandmother exchanged glances. The fortress, grandmother said. It had always been the place dearest to her. A place of strength, as they say. She would run there for comfort, and you can hide there so that no one can find you. It's a veritable underground labyrinth. You know that ancient fortress in the cave city. It's undergoing restoration. But somehow I don't doubt that Amber would run there. Jason closed his eyes a little, signaling that he'd taken note. Why don't I go there myself? His mother jumped up. What if she's really gone and is hiding there? I'll go and call. Don't even think about it, he said sharply. Nowhere, not a single step now, so as not to hurt your daughter or yourself. Your job is to wait. Do you realize how hard it is to wait and do nothing? Have you ever been through anything like this, been in our shoes? The last thing Jason would do in his life is tell Amber's grief-stricken relatives about Emily. Because they still had a chance. There was hope. She didn't. Amber really knew the underground labyrinths well. Of course, she couldn't go through all of them. Many of the passages were simply blocked, and no one was going to clear them. Cave vaults were crumbling, their corridors becoming impassable. She was risking everything, too. The company she'd fallen into could do anything to her first. There were no witnesses. and then dump her in one of the stone bags to make her go mad. No water, no food, and utter despair. Or even pushed off a cliff. Then again, who would see? But she was just beaten, tastefully, heartily. And then they pushed her into that death chamber that the tour guides like to scare tourists with. Apparently, Emir and his accomplices did not know these places so well, and this cave was known to everyone. Some said that they could put a prisoner here for decades, setting a completely insane ransom for him. Others said it was the place of execution, and they described in vivid color exactly how. Now, the narrow entrance was closed by an iron grate, but Emir, it turned out, had a key to it. He must have inherited it from his great-grandfather. This is where you'll sit. Amber was shoved back so hard that she couldn't keep her feet and fell to her knees on the stone floor. Maybe we'll stop by again tomorrow, Emir smirked, savoring every word and trying to catch the look of horror in her eyes. He didn't wait. The day after tomorrow, then. We have to bring you water, poor thing. But we'll only give it to you if you ask for it very nicely. Meet us on your knees with your mouth open, advised one of his buddies. Cheeky. Malnourished, covered in rashes. Amber couldn't let her hatred suffocate her now. Make her do something rash. She walked to the back of the cave, her cell, settled on the stone ledge, wrapped her arms around her knees, and stared out the window. Are you getting into character? Kyle Smith wondered. Like, go ahead and practice with the ghosts until we get there. They left, laughing, deliberately loudly discussing the next time they'd visit her. What would they do to her then? Amber didn't move until her acute hearing stopped picking up the sound of their footsteps and voices. There was the sound of a car pulling away, and then she caught her breath. Amber stood up and walked over to one of the windows cut into the stone. Rough, irregular squares, just enough to let light into the cave and gauge the thickness of the stone walls. The cave was cold, and it would get even colder at night. Amber knew she didn't have much time. Very little. 24 hours, maybe less. And no one would come here in that time. She didn't even doubt that. She couldn't think about her mother and grandmother going crazy at home. The thought of that was mentally distressing. But Amber couldn't suppress the agonizing feeling of thirst. She'd spent the entire day in the heat. She hadn't eaten since this morning. And then there was the worry. She walked slowly around the cave, examining every stone, tapping her fingers on it, but she couldn't see a glimmer of hope anywhere. The cave had been cleaned just for tourists, so that through the iron grating they could see the manicured walls, not the bare stone and ledge that had replaced the prisoner's bench and bed. And there's a rusty piece of iron sticking out. It must have been used to attach a chain, if it was to be put on the prisoner to intimidate him. Night came and brought no relief. Amber's eyes adjusted to the darkness quickly enough. It wasn't complete thanks to the windows. The night was clear, the moonlight walking through the cave from end to end. Amber was cold, but she didn't notice it herself. Her mind, however, seemed ready to boil. She searched again and again for a way out and didn't find it. But far more terrible than the night was the whole of the next day, when, beginning in the morning, she waited every minute for the arrival of her tormentors. She wondered exactly what they had in mind and realized that she had nothing at all, to defend herself. Every sound made her freeze and hold her breath. But they didn't come. Maybe they thought they'd give her a hard time, make her more cooperative. Maybe Kyle was just distracted by other things. By the evening of the second day, the thirst was almost unbearable. Amber thought seriously about the possibility that maybe some moisture would show up on the stone walls at night from the temperature difference and could be licked off with her tongue. There was no way to open the iron grate on the door, no way to dig under it. There was no earth here at all, just rock. The only thing Amber tried was to squeeze through the window. She almost succeeded, but it was the very last step, a desperate move. The only way to get out the window and plummet into the abyss was if there was no other way out and death was preferable. This is my fortress, my place. Amber thought, pressing her forehead against the cold stone. Why the hell can't I do this? Is it really hopeless and these walls won't do anything to help me? She navigated the stars pretty well and fell asleep probably around midnight. But she didn't sleep long, about 2 hours. She woke up when it was starting to get light. It was nearing dawn. But the windows of the cave faced north, and it was still dark, though in the east the sky must have already turned blue. At first she thought she was dreaming, because it couldn't be. In the corner of the cave, in the darkest corner of the cave, stood a girl. She was probably about 10 or 12 years old. Fragile, thin, as if she were just bones, wearing a floor-length cherry dress that seemed to glow slightly. The girl's hair was braided, and she wore a cap like a bonnet on her head. Amber began blinking frequently and even clenched her eyelids, because it couldn't be anything other than hallucinations from nerves and dehydration. The girl walked over to her. Amber realized that if it wasn't a vision of her inflamed brain, she was facing a ghost. But the little visitor was not transparent, only very pale. She picked up a pitcher, and a pitcher she happened to have, and gave Amber a drink. Never afterward could Amber forget drinking that strange water, or rather the mist that flowed from the jug, but it quenched thirst, and more than that. It gave her strength back. Shinika Amber asked quietly, "Is that you?" The girl blinked, just as Amber had done before. She was very small, very sad, and lonely to the point of heartbreak. Maybe it had been centuries since she'd had anyone to visit her, no one to fetch water for her. With inaudible steps, the girl went to the wall and lay down on the very iron that was sticking out of the stone. Nothing happened, but Amber understood her perfectly. 2 steps were enough for her to get next to the piece of metal and do what the little guest had done, lean on it with her chest and arms. The slit that opened in the wall was so narrow it looked like a trap. Step into it, and it would crush you. The girl was no longer behind Amber, but in front of her, somewhere in the dark depths, and there was a faint glow coming from it. And the girl didn't hesitate any longer. She stepped into the cramped corridor and walked, not even walked squeezed between the walls. Sometimes she had to make an effort to move on. And if something happened here, no one would ever find her. She realized that clearly. Enthusiasm gradually waned. She was going down somewhere, and the way went on endlessly. She seemed forbidden to think about anything. She had to keep going as long as she had the strength. And then, too inwardly, she tuned in to the fact that she would fall in the end. And maybe that wouldn't be the worst outcome. So she was startled to the core when suddenly there was a whiff of fresh night air, and they found themselves in a small cave-like alcove at the very foot of the mountain. They had climbed out. There was the trail that ran down from the fortress. Amber looked around in panic, searching for the girl with her gaze, but no one was near her anymore. Only there, somewhere up on the slope where the girl's grave was, a light flashed for a moment and then went out. Or maybe it was just a star falling. By the end of that first day after Amber's disappearance, Jason knew the license plate numbers of the cars that belonged to the owner's family and his cronies. Amber could have been kept in a castle, most likely where it was even more convenient to hide loose ends, and in case of such a need, literally. And yet there was still some chance that she'd been handled differently, that she was hidden somewhere, and that chance couldn't be dismissed. Jason waited. He had managed to get much closer to the castle unnoticed than Amber had led on. He was almost beside the road, and only a keen eye would have recognized him in the green thicket. The sniper rifle was with him, and he would be in trouble if one of his master's men had spotted him. There was no other way to interpret his behavior than ambush and hunt. It wasn't the eagles he'd chosen to hunt. Jason didn't know how long he'd be here before he learned something, got a clue. But he hadn't left here yet in the late afternoon, and it was already clear that he was going to spend the night. Jason fell asleep with his head resting on the damp forest floor. His hearing was keen, and it was unlikely that anyone would be able to approach him undetected. Jason had no idea that at some point his sleep would become so sound that it would transport him to another dimension, where what he saw was real. He saw a country and a girl, as if coming from the depths of time. The clothing had a purple hue that made it impossible to distinguish the gender in the darkness. It was something like a long dress, the kind you see in ethnographic museums. The girl stepped back, giving him a view of the cave, and there was Amber, sitting on a stone ledge. The panorama shifted, as if a movie camera had decided to film the background. Now the ancient fortress lay before him like a palm of his hand, and it was there that the cave was. The prisoners were in it. He himself looked at it all, lying on the mountainside with a rifle in his hands. It was early morning. A black Jeep was driving down the road below. Jason was awake before dawn had even broken. There was no fatigue, no heaviness in his head. On the contrary, he knew exactly what to do now. He didn't have to decide what was going to happen next. It was as if everything had been decided for him. Children are not responsible for their fathers, but sometimes it is clear from the very beginning that they will surpass them. And would a bullet between the eyes be punishment enough for the master? Suffering measured in moments. But to mourn the flesh of his flesh, the one he nurtured and raised to replace him, It would take years and end with life. It was getting light when Jason reached the town where he'd started on his way to the fortress. It took him another half hour or so to climb up to the ruins of the fortress, and then climbing higher to the top to take the place he had seen in his dream. Now the whole road lay before him. Anyone approaching he would see from a distance, and he would have time to take aim. He didn't even make an attempt to find Amber. A different task now faced him. Logically speaking, the owner's son couldn't have gotten here this early. Jason had to cover his eyes to bring his image back to life. Tall, with a fresh, plump face, large lips, clenched fists. A fortunate man who had never known hard work, but was used to taking down the defenseless. So used to it that he didn't even expect his victims to resent him. Only fear was on the faces raised to him in supplication. For a moment, feelings came over Jason. Such mental strife. He lowered his head and breathed evenly to keep from throwing up. Emir couldn't have gotten here earlier, because that fat turkey would probably be asleep before lunch. But Jason had seen his car against the dawn sky in a brief vision, and now he waited. When the murmur of an engine was heard in the distance, all he had to do was move the barrel of his rifle. He was no longer a man, he had become a fearless machine, and all the measurements, calculations were going on as if outside his consciousness. He did not even try to hit the darkened windows of the Jeep. The shot hit the tire. And that was enough. Afterward, Jason stood full length on the mountain, a black silhouette against the dawn sky, and stared at the car that had gone down, flipped over, rolled over twice hard, and finally burst into a tall fire. He had a little time. He knew that the fire would be visible from afar, that it would not be long before people would be rushing here. But he did not try to hide now, even though he should have covered his tracks as soon as possible. He walked toward the fortress because he knew it was the right thing to do. And he was not surprised when he saw the figure of a girl in the distance. She froze, and then slowly began to rise toward him. He had better not meet her, because if he didn't get one chance for luck, they would look for him on the ground and underground. They'd dig deep and they'd find him eventually. He couldn't let anyone suggest that Amber's fate had anything to do with him. Jason had his own reason for revenge, and more than a good one. He didn't believe that the dead forgave everything and everyone, that they didn't care about earthly matters. Jason thought that Amelie was only now truly at peace. He also knew that everything he'd signed up for, sending the car into the abyss, was justified, and that no matter what happened to himself, it was okay, because that girl was alive and would live, and no one would ever hurt her again. And he'd only go near her for a minute to make sure she was safe. Amber was already standing 2 feet away from him, and yes, she was in one piece, but there was blood on her cheek and hair. Jason held out his hand as if asking, "What is it?" "He is, isn't he?" Amber asked, pointing at the chasm. The man nodded. Then she unclenched her palm, which held the ruby earring torn from her ear. Amber wanted to throw it into the chasm too, but the earring flew a few feet away and disappeared into the dry grass.